I could barely breathe at my parents' anniversary celebration. The heavy scent of exotic botanical candles filled the air, suffocating me. I clawed at my empty clutch, desperate for my inhaler. My dad rolled his eyes. "Get up. Nobody is buying your act," my mom muttered. "You are always looking for attention." Then my sister's friend, a lung specialist, examined me. He looked up in horror and shouted, "Call 911 now!" For one long second, my parents turned pale as everyone stared at their cruelty. My name is Kendra Ross, and I am 34 years old. My lungs were burning. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. The lavish Manhattan high-rise ballroom was spinning. My parents, Charles and Beatrice, were celebrating their 35th anniversary. The room was dripping in money. Crystal chandeliers, a string quartet, and those damn candles. Exotic botanical blends. A severe trigger for my chronic asthma. I had emailed my mother twice last week, begging her to use unscented candles. I clutched my throat. The air simply refused to enter my lungs. I reached blindly for my purse where my emergency inhaler lived. My fingers found smooth silk instead of textured leather. It was an empty clutch. I looked up through watery eyes and saw my sister Madeline. She stood a few feet away sipping champagne, her perfect smile tightly in place. She had swapped my bag in the coat check. She said it was to match my dress, to fit the family aesthetic. I collapsed against the linen-covered table, knocking over a crystal water glass. It shattered, the sound slicing through the polite chatter of New York's elite. My father, Charles, turned toward me. He did not rush over. He did not ask if I was okay. His face tightened with irritation. He adjusted his custom-tailored suit jacket. "Get up, Kendra." He snapped, his voice a harsh whisper meant to avoid making a scene. "Nobody is buying your act. Stop embarrassing us in front of the board members." I tried to speak, to tell him I needed help, but only a wet, wheezing sound escaped. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white, my vision darkening at the edges. My mother, Beatrice, drifted over, her diamonds glittering under the lights. She looked down at me, her expression a mix of disgust and weariness. "You are always looking for attention," she muttered, leaning in so only I could hear. "Just like when you faked sick during Madeline's prom. Can you not let your sister have the spotlight for one night? She went to all the trouble of importing these candles from France, and you have to ruin it. Get off the floor." I was suffocating. My lips were turning numb. The room grew unnaturally quiet as people finally began to notice the woman dying on the floor. I saw Madeline whispering to her husband Xavier. He looked confused, his brow furrowed as he watched me struggle. Xavier was a venture capitalist, a Yale law graduate, and a man who prided himself on logic. He did not look amused by my parents' dismissiveness. Then a man pushed through the crowd. He was tall, dressed in a sharp tuxedo, and he did not hesitate. It was Dr. Logan Campbell, a prominent pulmonologist from Johns Hopkins and one of Madeline's medical colleagues. He dropped his champagne glass on a nearby tray and dropped to his knees beside me. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers pressing hard against my fading pulse. He tilted my head back, looking into my eyes. His expression shifted instantly from polite concern to sheer terror. He looked at my lips, which were now a terrifying shade of blue. He scrambled back, his voice booming through the silent ballroom. "Call 911. Now. She is in anaphylactic shock. She is dying. Don't just stand there, call an ambulance." The string quartet stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. My father, who just seconds ago was more concerned with his image than my life, froze. He stared at Dr. Campbell, his face draining of color. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her diamond rings flashing. For one long, agonizing second, they stood there exposed. The entire room of their wealthy peers, their business partners, and their friends watched as the reality of their cruelty hung in the air. Dr. Campbell did not wait for them. He pulled off his jacket and began administering emergency first aid. I was fading fast. The edges of the room went black. The last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was the wail of sirens echoing from the city streets below. I woke up to the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The harsh fluorescent lights of the ICU stung my eyes. I was in a hospital bed, a tube down my throat, machines humming around me. I tried to move, but my body felt like lead. A nurse noticed I was awake and quickly removed the tube. My throat was raw, my chest aching with every shallow breath. "Where are they?" I croaked, my voice a barely audible rasp. The nurse looked at me sympathetically. "Who, honey, your family? They left a few hours ago. They said they had to get back to their event." I closed my eyes. Of course they did. They went back to their party while I lay in a hospital bed. I was just an inconvenience. A disruption to their perfect anniversary celebration. A few hours later, a billing administrator walked into the room. He carried a clipboard and a hesitant smile. "Ms. Ross," he began, "I am sorry to bother you, but we have an issue with your insurance. It seems you were removed from your family's corporate health plans 6 months ago." I stared at him. Removed. My parents owned a mid-sized pharmaceutical company, Ross Diagnostics. I had always been on their corporate plan. They had cut me off without saying a word. The administrator handed me a preliminary bill. The ambulance, the emergency room, the ICU stay. It totaled $85,000. I looked at the number. My parents had quietly stripped away my safety net. I knew exactly why. 6 months ago was when Madeline bought her membership to that exclusive yacht club. They had cut my insurance to fund her lifestyle. I slowly reached into my bag, the one the hospital had retrieved from the restaurant. I pulled out a sleek, unbranded black card. I handed it to the administrator. "Run this for the full amount," I said calmly. He looked surprised, but took the card. Just as he turned to leave, the door to my room swung open. It was my parents. But they weren't there to ask how I was doing. They weren't there to apologize. They walked in holding a thick stack of legal documents, their faces set in grim determination. "My name is Kendra, 34 years old, and until yesterday, I allowed my family to suffocate me, both literally and figuratively." The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor pulled me from the darkness. The harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit stung my eyes as I forced them open. My throat felt like sandpaper rubbed raw from the emergency intubation tube that had saved my life. I tried to sit up, but my body felt like it was made of lead. A nurse adjusting my IV drip noticed I was awake and offered a warm, professional smile. She checked my vitals and told me how lucky I was to be alive. My first thought, ingrained by 34 years of conditioning, was to look around for my parents. The chairs in the corner of the sterile room were perfectly empty. I rasped out a question, asking if my family was in the waiting room. The nurse averted her eyes, suddenly very interested in my chart. "We called your emergency contacts, your parents. They said they would come, but they never showed up." The nurse explained they had answered the phone, confirmed I was stable, and stated they had VIP guests to entertain and a cake-cutting ceremony they simply could not miss. The familiar sting of rejection flared in my chest, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hardened clarity. I had nearly suffocated to death on the floor of a Manhattan ballroom, and Charles and Beatrice Ross had simply ordered another round of champagne. Before I could fully process the reality of their abandonment, the door creaked open. A hospital billing administrator stepped inside, clutching a clipboard tightly against his chest. He looked terribly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he approached the bed. He introduced himself as Mr. Evans and apologized for interrupting my recovery. He explained that there was a critical issue with my insurance on file. According to the hospital records, my coverage under the Ross Diagnostics corporate health plan had been terminated. I stared at him, the monitor beside me accelerating its beeping. I was secretly the majority shareholder of Apex Health, but to my parents, I was just their disappointing daughter, working a mid-level compliance job who relied on their corporate insurance to survive. I asked Mr. Evans when the policy was canceled. He looked down at his clipboard, his face flushing with professional embarrassment. He stated the policy had been retroactively terminated 6 months ago by the primary account holder. The timing hit me like a physical blow. 6 months ago was exactly when my sister Madeline had thrown a tantrum about needing an exclusive membership to the Hamptons Yacht Club. She claimed it was absolutely necessary to impress her husband Xavier's venture capital friends. My parents had quietly stripped away my medical safety net, leaving a chronic asthma sufferer completely uninsured just to hand over a massive initiation fee for Madeline's social climbing. Mr. Evans handed me the preliminary invoice. The itemized list included the emergency ambulance ride, the life-saving intubation respiratory therapies, and 3 days in the intensive care unit. I looked at the total at the bottom of the page: $85,000. He told me the hospital required a payment plan or an upfront deposit since I was technically uninsured. He also mentioned something incredibly disturbing. He noted that they had tried to run a standard credit check to offer me financing options, but my personal savings accounts were currently locked due to a pending legal hold. A sudden legal hold I knew absolutely nothing about. The old Kendra would have panicked. The old Kendra would have called Charles begging for help, apologizing for ruining his night, and accepting whatever emotional abuse he dealt out in exchange for a wire transfer. I had spent my entire childhood trying to be seen by them, trying to earn the attention and approval they gave Madeline so freely. But I was not that girl anymore. The near-death experience on that ballroom floor had burned away the last remnants of my familial loyalty. I reached over to the plastic belongings bag the hospital had placed on my bedside table. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally taking the gloves off. I bypassed my standard leather wallet, the one containing the frozen debit cards my parents knew about. Instead, I opened a hidden zipper compartment deep in the lining of my bag. I pulled out a solid, unbranded black card made of heavy titanium. This was the card tied directly to my private Apex Health executive accounts, completely invisible to the Ross family accountants and entirely shielded from whatever legal hold they had somehow orchestrated. I handed the heavy metal card to Mr. Evans. "Run this for the full amount," I said, my voice finally finding its strength and cutting through the quiet hum of the ICU. "No payment plans. Clear the entire balance immediately." Mr. Evans' eyes widened as he felt the weight of the card. In his line of work, he recognized an invitation-only tier of wealth when he saw it. He nodded quickly, his demeanor shifting from sympathetic to highly respectful, and turned toward the door to process the payment. Just as his hand touched the doorknob, the heavy door swung open from the other side, forcing him to step back. Charles and Beatrice Ross marched into my hospital room. They did not look relieved to see me awake. They did not rush to my bedside to hold my hand or ask how I was feeling. There were no tears of joy or apologies for leaving me alone. Instead, they stood at the foot of my bed, their faces set in grim, calculating masks. My father adjusted his expensive tailored tie, while my mother gripped her designer handbag tightly against her chest. But it was what my father was holding in his right hand that made the remaining air in my lungs evaporate. He held a thick stack of legal documents heavily stamped by the New York probate court. They had not come to check on my health. They had come to take my freedom. Charles kicks the door shut behind him with the heel of his Italian leather shoe. The heavy door seals with a definitive click, trapping me inside the sterile ICU room. "Mr. Evans." The billing administrator jumps in surprise. He clutches his clipboard tightly against his chest. Charles glares at the man. "Get out of here, now! This is private family business." Mr. Evans looks nervously from Charles to me. He is holding my titanium black card. I give him a single reassuring nod. Mr. Evans scurries past my parents without a word, slipping out of the room and leaving me entirely alone with the two people who just left me to die. Charles marches directly to the side of my bed. He does not ask how my lungs feel. He does not apologize for the anaphylactic shock. Instead, he tosses a thick, heavily stapled stack of legal documents onto the thin hospital blanket covering my legs. The bold black ink on the top page screams, "Emergency petition for conservatorship." My chest still aches with every shallow breath, but the shock of seeing those words sends a surge of pure adrenaline straight into my veins. I look from the papers to my father. He is adjusting his cuffs, staring down at me with the exact same cold calculation he uses when liquidating a rival company. My mother stands beside him, inspecting her pristine manicure. as if she is deeply bored by the sight of her daughter in a hospital gown. "You caused a massive, unforgivable scene tonight," Kendra Charles says. His voice is a low, dangerous rumble, screaming, thrashing on the floor, destroying a $30,000 anniversary gala in front of our most vital investors. "You humiliated this family for the very last time." "I had anaphylactic shock," I reply, keeping my voice dead level. Madeline swapped my purse to hide my emergency inhaler. Beatrice lets out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoes off the tile walls. "Always blaming your perfect sister. Always making up paranoid delusions. Madeline is a respected doctor at this very hospital. You are a paranoid, unstable woman who had a psychotic break in public because you could not stand watching your parents celebrate. It is exactly like the time you claimed your father locked you out of the house in a snowstorm just to steal sympathy from your grandfather." I look at her, remembering that night perfectly. I was 12 years old. My father had changed the security codes while I was walking the dog, because I refused to forge a signature on a school report. I nearly froze on the porch while they drank wine inside. But I do not argue the past. The past is dead. I tap the legal documents resting on my lap. "What is this, Charles?" I ask. "It is for your own good," Beatrice says, finally making eye contact. Her gaze is devoid of any maternal warmth, filled only with predatory calculation. "You are clearly a danger to yourself. Your erratic behavior, these alleged asthma attacks you use to manipulate people, your inability to maintain a normal social life. We are taking legal control of your medical and financial decisions before you completely ruin your life." I pick up the petition. The pages are crisp and freshly printed. They must have had their corporate lawyers drafting this while I was unconscious in the emergency room. My eyes scan the second page, bypassing the legal jargon, and the real motive jumps out at me in stark black and white text: the Harrington Trust. A laugh escapes my raw throat. It is a harsh, dry sound. This is about grandfather's trust fund. My father's jaw clenches. The veins in his neck bulge against his collar. My grandfather, a man who built his fortune with actual hard work and integrity, had seen right through Charles. Before he died, he bypassed his own son completely. He placed $3.5 million into an ironclad trust solely in my name, set to mature in full on my 35th birthday. That birthday is exactly 2 weeks away. "You are bankrupting Ross Diagnostics," I state, laying the papers flat on the bed. "You need immediate liquidity to fake your quarterly earnings before the Apex Health merger goes through. You removed me from the corporate health insurance to save a few $1,000s, and now you want to steal my inheritance to cover your corporate fraud." Charles steps closer to the bed, casting a dark shadow over me. "That money belongs to Ross Diagnostics," he growls. "Your grandfather was a spiteful old fool who did not understand the modern market. You have done absolutely nothing to earn $3.5 million. Madeline and Xavier need that capital to secure their new penthouse in Tribeca. They are actually building a legacy for this family. You just sit in a cubicle verifying compliance forms. You are a nobody. You are not touching my grandfather's money." I say, my voice steady, despite the monitor beeping faster beside me. "I will fight this in probate court. I will demand a full psychological evaluation from an independent medical board." Beatrice steps forward, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. "You really do not understand how the world works, Kendra. We already have a sworn affidavit from a board-certified psychiatrist. He reviewed the security footage of your little performance at the restaurant. He is ready to testify that you suffer from severe paranoid schizophrenia and require immediate institutionalization." I stare at her, letting the immense weight of her threat settle in the sterile air of the hospital room. They had a crooked doctor on their payroll. They were perfectly willing to lock their own daughter in a psychiatric ward, strip away her human rights, and drug her into submission just to drain her bank accounts and buy a penthouse for their golden child. "You sign this petition right now," Charles says. He pulls a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket and tosses it onto the papers on my lap. "You sign over full power of attorney, and we will let you live quietly in the guest house on the Hamptons estate. We will manage your care. We will manage the trust. You will never have to worry about a thing. And if I refuse, I ask." My fingers lightly brush the cold metal of the pen. Charles leans down, his face inches from mine. His breath smells of expensive scotch and raw ambition. If you refuse, I make one phone call. I have the hospital board bypass your discharge. I have you placed on an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold. You will be stripped of your clothes, locked in a padded room, and forcibly medicated until you are drooling on yourself. By the time you get in front of a judge, you will look exactly like the crazy woman we say you are. Sign the papers, Kendra. The silence in the room is absolute. Only the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor registers any sign of life. My parents stand over me waiting for the fear to set in. They expect me to crumble. They expect the asthma-ridden, overlooked middle child to surrender her independence to survive. They expect the girl who let them take the blame for Madeline's crimes years ago to simply fold and obey. I look down at the legal documents. I look at the gold fountain pen resting on the signature line. I pick up the pen. Beatrice lets out a long, satisfied exhale. Charles smirks, crossing his arms over his chest in absolute triumph. They think they have won. They think they own me. I look up, meeting my father's arrogant gaze. A slow, chilling smile spreads across my face. You really think I am the same helpless college girl, I ask? Before Charles can react, I grip both ends of his expensive gold pen and snap it completely in half. Ink splatters across the pristine white pages of their emergency petition, ruining the documents in a pool of dark blue. Charles freezes the crumpled, ink-stained petition clutched in his fist. He attempts to puff out his chest, trying to assert dominance over his son-in-law. But Xavier does not flinch. He steps further into the sterile light of the ICU, his dark eyes locked on the ruined legal document. Xavier Jones is a brilliant, no-nonsense African-American venture capitalist. He is a man who built his empire on identifying liabilities, analyzing risk, and spotting corporate fraud from a mile away. He is also a Yale Law graduate, which means he possesses a razor-sharp legal mind that does not tolerate deception. It is a private family matter, Xavier. Charles says, his voice losing its usual booming authority. Kendra had a severe episode tonight. We are simply taking the necessary steps to ensure her long-term well-being. By forcing her to sign a conservatorship petition while she is recovering from emergency intubation, Xavier asks. His voice is dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes a boardroom massacre. I may practice venture capital now, Charles, but my law degree is still perfectly valid. What you are attempting here is not just highly unethical, it borders on criminal coercion. Beatrice gasps, clutching the collar of her designer coat. Xavier, how dare you speak to your father-in-law that way? We love Kendra. We are trying to protect her from herself. Xavier ignores Beatrice entirely. He turns his discerning gaze toward his wife. Madeline is standing frozen by the side table, the two artisanal lattes completely forgotten. The perfect concerned smile she wore a moment ago has vanished, replaced by a tight, nervous grimace. You told me she had a hangover, Madeline, Xavier says, crossing his arms. His tailored suit jacket pulls taut across his broad shoulders. You told me she drank too much champagne, made an embarrassing scene, and was sleeping it off in a standard recovery room. Yet she is in the intensive care unit. She is hooked up to a cardiac monitor, and her throat is covered in deep purple bruising from a breathing tube. Do you want to explain to me how a champagne hangover requires life support? Madeline steps forward, reaching out to gently touch Xavier's arm. Her voice takes on that sickly sweet, placating tone she perfected as a child. Darling, you simply do not understand the history here. Kendra is deeply unstable. She had a massive panic attack and hyperventilated on the ballroom floor. The doctors had to sedate her for her own safety. You know she has a long track record of these dramatic attention-seeking episodes. I did not hyperventilate. I say, my voice raspy, but ringing loud enough to cut through my sister's web of lies. I went into anaphylactic shock. The ballroom was filled with exotic botanical candles, a severe trigger for my asthma. And when I reached into my purse for my emergency inhaler, it was gone. I shift my gaze from Xavier directly to Madeline. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing second before delivering the final blow. Because my perfect sister swapped my purse at the coat check, I state, watching Madeline flinch. She said my textured leather bag did not match the family aesthetic. Xavier turns slowly back to Madeline. His jaw is locked in a hard line. Is that true? He asks. Did you take her emergency inhaler? She is lying. Madeline shrieks, her voice climbing an octave and echoing off the tile walls. She is paranoid and completely delusional. This is exactly why Mom and Dad need to take control of her affairs. She makes up these insane conspiracy theories to ruin my life and sabotage my marriage. Charles seizes the opening, stepping forward to back up his golden child. Kendra is completely unhinged, Xavier. She is a danger to herself and a massive liability to this entire family. We have a sworn affidavit from a board-certified psychiatrist ready to place her on an involuntary hold if she refuses to cooperate. She needs to be permanently institutionalized. Xavier does not look at Charles. He keeps his eyes fixed on me. He spends his days analyzing investment risks and spotting hidden agendas. He is looking at me now, evaluating my steady pulse on the monitor, my calm demeanor, and the absolute clarity in my eyes. A conservatorship is a drastic, life-altering measure. Xavier notes his analytical mind visibly working through the puzzle pieces. It strips a person of their basic human rights and financial autonomy. Usually, there is a significant financial catalyst for such an extreme, sudden legal maneuver. He tilts his head, his gaze piercing. Why now, Charles? Why rush an emergency petition into an ICU room at this exact moment? I do not let my father answer. I seize the narrative. Because my grandfather's trust fund matures in exactly 2 weeks, I say. $3.5 million left exclusively to me, and Ross Diagnostics is facing bankruptcy. The hospital room goes dead silent. Charles turns a sickly shade of gray. Beatrice covers her mouth with her manicured hand. Xavier's posture goes completely rigid. The casual family hospital visit has just transformed into a corporate crime scene. Bankruptcy. Xavier repeats, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Charles, you sat in my office last week and told me the quarterly earnings for Ross Diagnostics were up 12%. You told me the Apex Health merger was moving forward without a single complication. They are faking their quarterly earnings. I continue pressing my advantage. They need immediate liquidity to cover the fraud before the merger audit catches the massive discrepancies. They cut my health insurance 6 months ago to pay for Madeline's yacht club initiation fee, and now they want to steal my inheritance to save their sinking company. Shut up! Madeline screams, her carefully crafted mask shattering completely. She lunges forward, pointing a trembling finger at my face. Her eyes are wild with sheer panic and rage. Do not listen to her, Xavier. She is a pathetic, jealous loser. She is nothing. Madeline grabs the metal footboard of my hospital bed, her knuckles turning white. She leans in, her voice dripping with venom. Sign the new petition, Kendra. You are a complete failure. A med school dropout working a miserable desk job cannot possibly manage millions of dollars. You do not even know how to balance a checkbook without Dad's help. I look at my sister. For years, I carried the heavy weight of her sins. I took the blame, accepted the crushing shame, and let my parents brand me a failure just to protect their fragile, perfect image of her. I let them destroy my future to save hers. But the woman who would have cowered from this confrontation died on that ballroom floor tonight. I sit up slightly, ignoring the burning pain in my chest. I do not look at Madeline. Instead, I lock eyes directly with Xavier. I see the sharp intelligence there, the relentless pursuit of the truth. Ask your wife why I dropped out of medical school, Xavier. I say, my voice cold and sharp as cracked glass. Madeline freezes. The color instantly drains from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She opens her mouth, but no sound comes out. Ask her what really happened during our final year. I continue, keeping my gaze locked firmly on Xavier. Ask her whose fingerprints were actually found on the stolen lab narcotics. The silence that follows is deafening. The only sound is the frantic, elevated beeping of my heart monitor and the sharp intake of breath from my mother. Xavier is a man who relies on facts. He possesses a brilliant legal mind trained to spot inconsistencies and unravel complex webs of deceit. He slowly turns his head to look at his wife. He takes in her suddenly panicked face, her wide, terrified eyes, and her trembling hands gripping the hospital bed. The pieces of the puzzle shift and snap into place, his eyes narrow with dark, calculating suspicion. I stepped out of the cab in front of my modest Brooklyn walk-up. My lungs still ached with every deep breath, but the fresh air against my face felt like a hard-won victory. The air in the ICU had grown entirely too toxic for my parents, especially after Xavier began demanding answers they simply could not provide. They had fled the hospital shortly after my revelation, leaving their shattered conservatorship petition on the floor. 2 days later, my attending physician officially cleared me for discharge. My body was healing, and my mind had never been sharper. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, my legs slightly weak, but moving with purpose. I pulled my house key from my pocket and slid it into the brass deadbolt of apartment 3B. The key refused to turn. I pulled it out, wiped it on my jeans, and tried again. It hit a solid block. The cylinder was completely different. It was a brand new lock. Before I could knock, the door swung inward. My mother stood in the doorway wearing a pristine cashmere trench coat and holding a clipboard. Behind her, 3 burly men in gray moving uniforms were hauling cardboard boxes out of my bedroom. They were packing up my entire life. My books, my clothes, the small collection of vintage teacups I had gathered over a decade. All of it was being unceremoniously dumped into standard moving crates. Charles stood near the kitchen island, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward my modest television set, instructing a mover to wrap it in thick industrial plastic. I stepped over the threshold, my pulse steadying into a calm, rhythmic beat. I looked directly at my father and asked him what exactly he thought he was doing. Charles turned around, a deeply satisfied, predatory smirk playing on his lips. He informed me that I was being evicted. He then happily reminded me of a financial detail I had pushed to the back of my mind years ago. When I took the fall for Madeline's stolen lab narcotics and dropped out of medical school, my reputation and credit were instantly obliterated. No reputable landlord in the city would rent to a disgraced dropout. Charles had magnanimously offered to co-sign the lease on this tiny apartment. He had held that favor over my head for a decade. Now he was using it as a weapon. Charles proudly explained that as the primary financial guarantor, he possessed the legal right to terminate the lease at his discretion. He had paid my landlord a massive premium fee to expedite the process, citing my recent public medical incident as undeniable proof that I could no longer live independently. The landlord, eager for a massive cash buyout, had happily complied. My father stepped closer, his expensive cologne filling the cramped space. He told me he had also contacted the bank that very morning. He completely froze the joint checking account he had set up for me during college, the one where my meager compliance officer salary was directly deposited. He assumed the heavy titanium card I used at the hospital was simply a high-limit credit card I had foolishly maxed out. In his arrogant mind, I was completely destitute. I was a sick, unemployed woman with a frozen bank account, ruined credit, and absolutely nowhere to sleep. Beatrice drifted over to stand beside him. She looked around the small, box-filled apartment with absolute, undisguised disgust. She crossed her arms, fixing me with a cold, triumphant glare. "You have no credit, no home, and no family," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with venom. "Come back to the estate where we can monitor you." Her plan was perfectly transparent. They wanted to drag me back to the Hamptons guest house. They wanted to lock me behind their heavy iron gates, heavily medicate me under the guise of psychiatric care, and parade their crooked paid-off doctor in front of a judge to finalize the conservatorship. Once they had total legal control over my life, my grandfather's $3.5 million trust fund would be theirs to drain. They would save Ross Diagnostics from bankruptcy and buy Madeline her precious penthouse, all while I withered away in a gilded cage. They looked at me, waiting for the tears. They expected me to fall to my knees, beg for forgiveness, and accept my fate as their compliant, broken victim. I looked at the boxes holding the remnants of my fake, modest life. Then I looked at my parents. I did not cry. I smiled. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I bypassed my standard contacts and dialed a private, unlisted number. The call was answered on the very first ring. I spoke clearly and concisely into the receiver. "Bring the car around to the Brooklyn address. Yes, right now." The entire call lasted less than 10 seconds. I dropped the phone back into my pocket and turned toward the stairs. I told the movers they could keep the television and the cheap furniture, but to leave the boxes of books and clothes on the curb. Then I walked down the 3 flights of stairs without looking back. Charles and Beatrice scrambled after me, their expensive shoes clacking loudly against the worn wooden steps. They followed me out onto the busy Brooklyn sidewalk. Charles was shouting, demanding to know who I had called, threatening to call the police and report me as a mentally unstable runaway. He promised I would not survive a single night on the streets of New York without his money. I stood on the edge of the curb, letting the cool city wind brush against my face. Less than 2 minutes later, a massive, gleaming black luxury SUV glided smoothly down the street and pulled up precisely where I stood. The tinted windows hid the interior, but the sheer presence of the vehicle commanded immediate respect from everyone on the block. The driver's door opened. A tall, sharply dressed man in a tailored dark suit stepped out. He walked directly to me, completely ignoring Charles and Beatrice, who had suddenly fallen dead silent. "Good afternoon, Ms. Ross," the driver said, his tone highly professional and deeply respectful. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy silver keyring holding a single sleek electronic fob. He placed it gently into my open palm. "Here are the keys to the Tribeca penthouse, exactly as you requested. The private staff has already stocked the refrigerator and prepared the master suite." I wrapped my fingers around the cold metal. A $4 million piece of prime New York real estate. A penthouse I had quietly purchased through Apex Health months ago. It was the exact same luxury building Madeline and Xavier had been desperately trying to buy into, the one my parents were planning to steal my inheritance to fund. I opened the heavy rear door of the SUV and climbed into the plush leather interior. I looked out the window one last time as the engine purred to life. Charles and Beatrice were left standing on the dirty Brooklyn curb, the wind whipping their expensive coats, their faces frozen in a portrait of utter spectacular confusion. The heavy doors of the SUV shut out the cold Brooklyn wind and the sight of my parents standing on the curb. As the driver navigated toward Manhattan, I let out a long, steady breath. The Tribeca penthouse was everything I had envisioned when I signed the closing papers under a blind LLC 3 months ago. Stepping out of the private elevator into my new foyer, I was greeted by soaring, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. The space was immaculate, secure, and entirely mine. There were no co-signers, no leveraged favors, and absolutely no access for Charles and Beatrice Ross. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, but my family did not. When I woke the next morning, my phone was vibrating so violently against the marble nightstand it threatened to fall off the edge. I picked it up to find 94 unread text messages, 40 missed calls, and an endless stream of social media notifications. Madeline had gone to war. Unable to physically drag me back to their estate, she had launched a brutal, calculated public smear campaign. I opened the most tagged video on her social media profile. Madeline sat on the edge of her plush velvet sofa, wearing zero makeup and an oversized sweater to project an image of raw vulnerability. She stared directly into the camera, her eyes perfectly pooled with manufactured tears. "I am making this video because our family is living a nightmare," Madeline sniffled, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "Many of you know my sister Kendra has struggled with her mental health since dropping out of medical school. Yesterday, she suffered a complete psychotic break. She has fled her apartment and is currently suffering from severe paranoia and delusions of grandeur. She believes she is living a secret life of wealth. If anyone sees her, please do not engage with her delusions. Contact us immediately. We just want to get her into a secure psychiatric facility so she can get the heavy medication she desperately needs." The comments section was a disaster zone of misplaced pity and outrage. Extended family members, mutual friends, and even former classmates were flooding the post with prayers and horrified reactions. My phone screen lit up with an incoming call from Aunt Clara, my mother's notoriously judgmental sister. I answered, putting her on speakerphone as I walked into the kitchen to brew some coffee. "Kendra, thank God you answered," Aunt Clara gasped, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your mother has been up all night sobbing. Madeline told us everything. Sweetheart hiring actors to drive you away in a rented SUV and pretending you own a penthouse is a textbook manic episode. You are sick. You need to tell us where you are hiding so Charles can send the doctors to collect you." I poured hot water over my coffee grounds, watching the dark liquid bloom. They were actually trying to spin my $4 million property as a hallucination. Charles and Beatrice could not fathom that I had outplayed them financially, so they were feeding the entire family a narrative that I was clinically insane. It was a brilliant, vicious tactic. If they convinced everyone I was delusional, any truth I exposed about their bankrupt company would be instantly dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. "I am perfectly fine, Aunt Clara," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "And I am not hiding. I simply upgraded my living situation." "Kendra, stop this right now!" Aunt Clara snapped, her tone turning sharp. "You are embarrassing the Ross family name. You have no money and no career. Stop this childish charade and go back to your parents before they have you arrested for your own safety." I ended the call without another word. I opened my phone settings, blocked her number, and then systematically muted every single social media application on the device. I refused to take the bait. The old Kendra would have fired back with an angry post desperately trying to defend her sanity to people who had already made up their minds. The old Kendra would have cried over the betrayal. But I was done playing defense. I carried my coffee to the massive oak dining table and opened my laptop. It was time to go on the offensive. I bypassed my standard email client and logged into an encrypted secure server. I typed in the contact information for Marcus Vance. Marcus was a ruthless, independent forensic accountant. He had spent 15 years working as a lead investigator for the Securities and Exchange Commission before starting his own private firm. He specialized in unearthing hidden offshore accounts, identifying corporate embezzlement, and tearing apart falsified quarterly earnings. I had quietly retained his services on a small retainer a month ago, right after Charles first cut my health insurance. Now I was giving him the green light for a full-scale audit. I attached a compressed folder to the message. It contained the internal compliance reports I had secretly copied from Ross Diagnostics before my father locked me out of the company servers. It included the preliminary merger documents with Apex Health, a list of suspicious vendor payouts signed by Madeline, and the severely inflated revenue projections Charles had presented to the board of directors. "Marcus," I typed, "the gloves are off. I need a complete teardown of Ross Diagnostics. Follow the vendor payouts to Madeline's accounts. Cross-reference the Apex Health merger valuations with their actual liquid assets. Find the black hole where their money is vanishing." I hit send. Then I closed the laptop, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and looked out over the Manhattan skyline. Let Madeline cry on the internet. Let my parents spin their pathetic lies to the extended family. I was not fighting a public relations battle. I was orchestrating a corporate execution. For the next 48 hours, I did not leave the penthouse. I watched the smear campaign escalate from a distance. Madeline posted updates claiming I was refusing life-saving treatment. Charles sent a mass email to the Family Trust Board, officially petitioning to have me removed as a beneficiary due to extreme mental incapacity. They were moving incredibly fast, desperate to secure the conservatorship before the Apex Health merger finalized. They were terrified. On the evening of the second day, a sharp ping echoed from my laptop. It was an alert from the encrypted server, a message from Marcus Vance. My pulse quickened as I opened the secure portal. There was no greeting, no pleasantries. There was only a single heavily encrypted PDF file and a 2-line message. "It's worse than you thought. They aren't just broke, they are committing federal fraud." I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, the words from Marcus Vance echoing in the silent, cavernous space of my penthouse. Federal fraud. The phrase carried a heavy, undeniable weight. It meant prison time. It meant asset seizure. It meant the complete and total annihilation of the Ross family name. I clicked on the encrypted PDF Marcus had attached, my eyes scanning the dense rows of financial data. Marcus had mapped out a sophisticated network of shell companies and phantom vendors. For the past 3 years, Charles and Beatrice had been systematically bleeding Ross Diagnostics dry. They were billing Medicare for diagnostic panels that were never run, funneling the illicit revenue through offshore accounts, and using the dirty money to fund Madeline's extravagant lifestyle. The upcoming merger with Apex Health was not a strategic business move. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to use Apex's capital to fill the gaping black hole in their own ledgers before the federal auditors arrived. My grandfather's $3.5 million trust fund would have been a temporary bandage on a fatal wound. Before I could dive deeper into the labyrinth of fraudulent invoices, the burner phone sitting on my marble kitchen island buzzed. I had discarded my old phone entirely to escape Madeline's relentless harassment and the flood of messages from confused relatives. Only 3 people possessed this new number: Marcus, my real estate broker, and my attorney. I picked it up. The caller ID displayed a blocked number. Kendra. The voice was deep, authoritative, and completely unmistakable. It was Xavier Jones. "How did you get this number, Xavier?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "I run a venture capital firm that specializes in hostile acquisitions and corporate intelligence," Xavier replied, his voice clipped and highly professional. "Finding an unlisted number takes my team exactly 4 minutes. I am sitting at a corner table in a coffee shop in Soho, the Bluebird Cafe. I want you here in 20 minutes. No lawyers, no family, just you and me." "And if I decline?" "You will not decline," Xavier stated with absolute certainty, "because you know I am the only person in your family's orbit who actually cares about the truth." He ended the call. He was right. Xavier was a man governed by logic, risk assessment, and undeniable facts. My parents' frantic smear campaign painting me as a delusional, paranoid psychotic did not align with the calm, calculating woman he had witnessed in the intensive care unit. Xavier needed data to close the gap in the narrative. I walked to my home office, opened a locked, fireproof filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I had kept this single file hidden for 5 years. It was the only insurance policy I possessed against my family, and until now, I had never dared to use it. I slid the envelope into my leather tote bag, grabbed my coat, and headed for the private elevator. The Bluebird Cafe was small, dimly lit, and smelled strongly of roasted espresso beans and rain. Xavier sat at a secluded table in the far back corner. He wore a dark charcoal suit minus the tie, his posture rigidly straight. A black cup of untouched coffee sat in front of him. He watched me approach with sharp, assessing eyes, tracking my steady gait and calm demeanor. He was looking for the severe paranoia and psychotic break Madeline had so loudly broadcasted to the world. He found none of it. I sat down across from him. I did not order anything. "Madeline posted a 20-minute video this morning claiming you are suffering from delusions of grandeur." Xavier began, his voice low and intensely focused. "Charles sent a mass email to the trust board stating you are medically incompetent. Beatrice is telling the country club you have fled into the streets and are refusing psychiatric care." "I am aware," I replied smoothly. "Yet here you sit," Xavier noted, leaning forward slightly. "You look remarkably healthy for a woman who allegedly requires involuntary institutionalization. The narrative your parents are spinning is sloppy. It is reactionary. People who tell the truth do not panic, Kendra. They do not rush conservatorship papers into an ICU. I want to know exactly what is going on, and I want to know what you meant about the stolen narcotics." He was demanding the missing variable in his equation. I looked at the man who had unknowingly married into a family of absolute frauds. I felt no pity, only a cold clinical resolve. I did not rant about the injustice of my ruined life. I did not cry over the 5 years of emotional abuse. Tears and anger were currencies my family used to manipulate people. I dealt in hard evidence. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out the manila envelope. I placed it on the wooden table and slowly slid it across to him. "You value integrity, Xavier. Read it." Xavier looked at the envelope, then up at me before breaking the seal. He pulled out the stack of documents. It was a heavily redacted disciplinary file from the University Medical Board. I watched his dark eyes scan the first page. I spoke clearly, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. 5 years ago, Madeline was failing her residency. She buckled under the pressure. To cope, she began stealing Schedule II narcotics from the secure campus laboratory. She used them, and when her credit cards were maxed out, she sold them. The university initiated a blind audit and discovered the missing inventory. They launched a full investigation. Xavier turned to the second page, his jaw clenched tight. Charles intervened before the police were notified. I continued. He made a massive untraceable donation to the university's endowment fund. But the board required a scapegoat to close the investigation legally. Charles gave them one. I took the fall. I signed a confession admitting to the theft. I was expelled. My record was permanently destroyed, and Madeline walked away with a spotless reputation. Xavier was reading the signed confession. He was looking at the dates. He was looking at the sealed settlement agreement signed by Charles Ross. The documents were irrefutable. They completely dismantled the flawless, innocent image of the woman he called his wife. This is why they treat you with such open contempt. Xavier murmured, his voice laced with dark realization. You are not a failure. You are a walking liability. You are the only person who knows what she truly is. He stared at the final page of the report, the stark reality of the betrayal settling over him. He had built his entire career on vetting investments, yet he had been completely blinded by the Ross family facade. Suddenly, the harsh vibration of a cell phone shattered the quiet tension at the table. Xavier's phone lit up against the dark wood. The caller ID read Charles Ross. Xavier stared at the flashing name for a long moment. He looked up at me, his eyes hardening into twin chips of obsidian. He reached out and pressed the speakerphone button, answering the call without offering a greeting. Xavier, thank God I reached you. Charles's booming, frantic voice echoed from the small speaker. The false bravado was completely stripped away, leaving only raw, naked desperation. I need a massive favor. I need you to bypass your firm's standard auditing process and expedite a $20 million venture capital injection into Ross Diagnostics. I need the funds transferred by tomorrow morning, Xavier. You have to do this to save the family legacy. Xavier sat perfectly still. He looked at the undeniable proof of his wife's crimes resting in his hands, then looked directly into my eyes as my father begged for a financial lifeline. The heavy oak doors of the Manhattan surrogate court swung shut, sealing us inside the austere wood-paneled room. The air was thick with the suffocating tension of a family war turning into a legal execution. 3 days had passed since I slid Madeline's redacted criminal file across the table to Xavier. He had not returned to the family brownstone that night. Madeline's frantic, unanswered calls to his phone were the only music I needed. Now she sat on the petitioner's bench next to Charles and Beatrice. My parents had dressed carefully for the part of grieving, concerned caretakers. Charles wore a conservative gray suit instead of his usual aggressive navy pinstripe. Beatrice held a lace handkerchief, occasionally dabbing at completely dry eyes. Madeline kept twisting around in her seat, her eyes darting toward the gallery doors, still desperately hoping her husband would walk through them to support her narrative. He was not coming. I sat calmly at the respondent's table next to my attorney, Evelyn Sterling. Evelyn was a corporate litigator who specialized in dismantling hostile takeovers. She was not a standard family lawyer, which was precisely why I hired her. We were not fighting a medical battle. We were fighting a hostile corporate acquisition of my autonomy. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, called their first witness. Charles stood up and practically beamed as Dr. Elias Montgomery took the stand. Dr. Montgomery was the kind of highly paid, unethical psychiatrist elite families kept on retainer to quietly erase their embarrassing problems. He was a master of weaponizing clinical jargon to serve the highest bidder. He smoothed his expensive silk tie and swore to tell the whole truth. Charles's attorney guided Dr. Montgomery through his opening statements, allowing him to establish his supposedly impeccable credentials. Then came the character assassination. Dr. Montgomery, having conducted a comprehensive review of the respondent's medical history and recent behavioral patterns, "What is your professional assessment of Kendra Ross?" the opposing counsel asked. Dr. Montgomery let out a heavy, practiced sigh. He looked toward the judge with an expression of profound manufactured sympathy. It is my professional opinion that Kendra is suffering from a rapid-onset schizoaffective disorder compounded by severe borderline personality traits, Dr. Montgomery stated smoothly. She has experienced a complete break from reality following a minor respiratory event at a recent gala. She is exhibiting dangerous, erratic behavior that makes her entirely unfit to manage her own financial or medical affairs. I watched Charles lean back in his chair, a smug, satisfied smirk spread across his face. Beatrice reached over and patted his hand affectionately. They thought they had already won. They had written the script, paid the actor, and bought the stage. Can you provide the court with specific examples of this erratic behavior? The lawyer prompted. Certainly, Dr. Montgomery replied, leaning into the microphone. Kendra is suffering from extreme delusions of grandeur. Just a few days ago, she staged a highly theatrical exit from her subsidized Brooklyn apartment. She hired actors and a luxury vehicle to fake a glamorous rescue. She has convinced herself and is actively telling others that she owns a $4 million penthouse in Tribeca. Madeline let out a quiet, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth as if the tragedy of my insanity was simply too much to bear. Dr. Montgomery continued, his voice dripping with clinical condescension. The delusions go much further. Kendra genuinely believes she is secretly running a massive anonymous healthcare conglomerate. She has convinced herself that she possesses the business acumen to rival her father's company, Ross Diagnostics. She is spinning wild, paranoid conspiracy theories, claiming her family is trying to steal her inheritance, when in reality they are simply trying to save her life. If she is given access to her upcoming trust fund, she will undoubtedly squander it on these manic, fabricated realities. She requires immediate involuntary psychiatric commitment and a full conservatorship. The opposing counsel thanked the doctor and sat down. The trap had been set perfectly. They had laid out every piece of my actual life, my real estate, my corporate maneuvering, my knowledge of their fraud, and painted it as clinical insanity. It was a brilliant, terrifying strategy. If a judge believed I was hallucinating my wealth and power, any evidence I brought forward regarding Charles's federal crimes would be instantly dismissed as paranoid ravings. Evelyn Sterling stood up. She did not rush. She smoothed the front of her blazer, picked up a single manila folder, and walked to the podium. The sharp click of her heels echoed in the silent courtroom. Dr. Montgomery. Evelyn began, her voice calm and razor-sharp. You have painted a very vivid picture of my client's mental state. You claim she is suffering from delusions of grandeur because she believes she owns a $4 million Tribeca penthouse. Is that correct? Yes, that is correct, Dr. Montgomery said, lifting his chin arrogantly. It is a textbook manifestation of a manic episode. Evelyn opened her folder. She pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers bearing an official raised state seal. I am submitting into evidence Exhibit A, Evelyn stated, handing a copy to the bailiff. The official certified property deed for Penthouse B at the Apex Tower in Tribeca. The property was purchased in full in cash 3 months ago. The sole owner listed on the deed is Kendra Ross. Tell me, doctor, how does one hallucinate a notarized property deed? The color drained out of Dr. Montgomery's face. He blinked rapidly, his arrogant posture instantly crumbling. Charles shot up in his seat, his jaw dropping open. Madeline let out a very real, very ugly sound of pure shock. I object. Charles's lawyer sputtered, scrambling to his feet, knocking a heavy legal pad onto the floor. This document must be a forgery. The court clerk can verify the seal right now, Evelyn countered smoothly, never breaking eye contact with the sweating psychiatrist. My client is not hallucinating her wealth. She is simply significantly wealthier than her parents. Evelyn did not give them a single second to recover. She stepped closer to the witness stand, closing the distance like a shark circling its prey. Dr. Montgomery, you also testified under penalty of perjury that my client's claims regarding her family's financial motives are paranoid delusions. You stated she requires a conservatorship strictly for her medical well-being, and that there is no ulterior financial motive at play here. Is that your sworn expert opinion? It is my medical assessment, yes. Dr. Montgomery stammered, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges of the witness stand. His eyes darted nervously toward Charles. "And how much were you compensated for this allegedly objective medical assessment?" Evelyn asked, her voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. "My standard consultation fee," Dr. Montgomery replied, his voice pitching higher. "I deeply resent the implication that my medical ethics are for sale in any capacity." Evelyn smiled. It was a terrifying expression. She turned her back on him and walked over to our table. She did not pick up another piece of paper. Instead, she picked up a small, sleek silver flash drive. She held it up high so the entire courtroom could see it glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Your Honor," Evelyn said, her voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. "We'd like to play a wiretapped phone call between this doctor and Charles Ross from 48 hours ago." Judge Harrison's gavel remained suspended in midair. She stared at Evelyn Sterling with a mixture of intense scrutiny and professional curiosity. A wiretapped phone call counselor in a civil conservatorship hearing, obtained entirely legally through a third-party private investigator who was granted consent by an informant within Dr. Montgomery's own administrative staff, Evelyn replied smoothly, never missing a beat. The informant was concerned about illegal billing practices and began recording office lines last month. We subpoenaed the raw audio files yesterday morning. Judge Harrison turned her sharp gaze to the opposing counsel, who was currently looking at Charles Ross as if he had just handed him a live hand grenade. "Proceed, Ms. Sterling." Evelyn plugged the silver flash drive into the court's audiovisual terminal. The courtroom speakers crackled to life with a sharp hiss of static, followed by the unmistakable booming baritone of my father. "Elias, stop whining about your medical license. I do not pay you a retainer to have a conscience." A collective stifled gasp rippled through the few clerks and legal aides in the room. "Charles, you are asking me to fabricate a severe schizoaffective diagnosis for a woman I have never personally examined," Dr. Montgomery's recorded voice replied, shaking with nervous energy. "If she demands an independent evaluation, the clinical discrepancies will be glaring. The medical board will strip my license." "The medical board is the least of your concerns right now," Charles countered on the tape, his tone dripping with malice. "You owe the underground sports books in Atlantic City over $250,000. They are not going to revoke your license, Elias. They are going to break your legs." I watched my mother physically recoil. Beatrice dropped her lace handkerchief onto the polished wooden floor, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Madeline sank so low in her seat, she practically disappeared behind the wooden partition, her face buried in her hands. Charles sat frozen. The blood drained from his face until his skin matched the pristine white collar of his bespoke shirt. "I am wiring $300,000 to your offshore Cayman's account the second you sign the sworn affidavit declaring Kendra medically incompetent." The recorded version of Charles continued, delivering the final fatal blow. "You pay off your bookies and I secure the conservatorship over her assets before the Apex Health merger goes through. We both get exactly what we want. Do we have a deal?" A long agonizing pause echoed through the courtroom speakers. "Send the wire transfer. I will have the affidavit signed by noon." The recording clicked off, leaving a silence in the courtroom so profound it was almost deafening. The air felt entirely devoid of oxygen. The highly paid, unethical psychiatrist, whom elite families kept on retainer, was currently gripping the edges of the witness stand so tightly his knuckles were translucent. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. Evelyn Sterling did not gloat. She did not need to. She simply stepped back to our table and folded her hands. "Your Honor, the respondent respectfully requests this fraudulent petition be dismissed with prejudice." Judge Harrison was a woman known for maintaining absolute decorum, but the raw, unadulterated fury radiating from the bench was palpable. She slowly removed her reading glasses and fixed her gaze directly on Charles Ross. "I have sat on this bench for 22 years. Judge Harrison began, her voice a dangerously quiet rumble that echoed off the mahogany walls. "I have presided over bitter family disputes, contested estates, and ugly divorces. but I have rarely witnessed such a grotesque, calculated, and malevolent abuse of the judicial system. She turned her lethal glare to the witness stand. Dr. Montgomery, you are instructed not to leave this jurisdiction. I am immediately forwarding this recording, along with a full transcript of your perjured testimony today, to the State Medical Board and the District Attorney's Office. You will be facing severe criminal charges for fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. Dr. Montgomery opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He simply nodded, a thoroughly broken man. Judge Harrison then brought the full weight of her authority down on my parents. Mr. Ross, you attempted to use this court to falsely imprison your own daughter in a psychiatric facility purely for financial gain. You weaponized the legal and medical systems to facilitate extortion. This petition is dismissed with prejudice, and I assure you the district attorney will be looking into your involvement in this conspiracy. Do not attempt to contact your daughter again. The sharp, authoritative crack of the gavel hitting the sounding block signaled the end of the execution. Court is adjourned. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of calm. The nightmare they had tried to construct for me had burned to the ground in less than 3 minutes. Evelyn packed her briefcase with practiced efficiency, offering me a tight, victorious smile. You did well, Kendra, Evelyn murmured. Let's go. We walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The opposing counsel was already aggressively whispering to Charles, likely attempting to resign on the spot to save his own firm from the impending fallout. Beatrice was sobbing openly now, her carefully constructed high society facade completely shattered. Madeline followed her parents, her eyes darting nervously toward the exits, terrified of the media presence that would undoubtedly catch wind of this scandal. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the expansive, marble-floored hallway of the courthouse. The echoing space was mostly empty, save for a few lingering clerks and security personnel. Before Evelyn and I could reach the bank of elevators, rapid, heavy footsteps echoed behind us. Kendra! I turned to see Charles storming out of the courtroom. He had completely lost the polished, arrogant poise that defined his entire existence. His tie was loosened, his face was flushed a dark, angry crimson, and his eyes were wild with cornered desperation. The man who had commanded boardrooms with a single look was now reduced to a frantic, snarling mess. He blocked my path to the elevators, ignoring Evelyn's immediate step forward to shield me. Madeline hovered a few feet behind him, tugging nervously at her designer bag. "Dad, stop, people are watching," Madeline hissed, but Charles ignored her. "You think you are so incredibly smart," Charles spat, pointing a trembling finger inches from my face. The mask had completely slipped, revealing the terrifying, greedy monster I had always known existed beneath the bespoke suits. "You think destroying Elias Montgomery changes anything about the reality of our situation? It changes the fact that I'm walking out of here a free woman, and you are likely facing federal indictment," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. I looked at the man who had raised me, feeling absolutely nothing for him. Charles let out a harsh, manic laugh that echoed down the marble corridor. It was the sound of a man clinging to his final shred of power. "You might have won today," Charles snarled, leaning in so close I could smell the stale coffee and pure panic on his breath. "But you are completely forgetting the bigger picture. Ross Diagnostics is officially merging with Apex Health tomorrow morning. The ink is drying on the contracts as we speak. We will be billionaires by noon, Kendra. Do you hear me, billionaires? And with that kind of capital, we will buy every judge, every lawyer, and every politician in this city. We will bury you in litigation until you break." The glass doors of Xavier's corner office violently swung open, shattering the quiet focus of his afternoon. Charles Ross marched in his usually immaculate gray suit, rumpled, and a frantic sheen of sweat coating his forehead. Beatrice trailed closely behind him, wringing her hands in a performance of utter fabricated distress. Xavier did not rise from his leather chair. He simply closed the dossier he had been reading and waited. Charles planted his hands firmly on Xavier's desk, leaning forward with wild, desperate eyes. He demanded that Xavier bypass the standard compliance checks and immediately authorize the $20 million venture capital injection. Charles claimed the money was a necessary bridge loan to satisfy a sudden liquidity requirement from Apex Health. He insisted the merger would collapse by morning, without those funds destroying the family legacy. Xavier remained perfectly still. He asked Charles directly how the conservatorship hearing had concluded. Charles waved his hand dismissively, masking his profound panic with a forced scoff. He lied effortlessly, claiming a rogue, incompetent judge had thrown out their valid medical concerns on a minor procedural technicality. Beatrice immediately chimed in, pressing a tissue to her dry eyes, lamenting how terrified she was for Kendra's safety on the streets of New York. The performance was flawless, rehearsed, and entirely transparent. Xavier looked at his father-in-law, a man begging for $20 million, while casually omitting the fact that he was facing a federal perjury investigation. Xavier stated he needed until midnight to review the final financials before authorizing the wire transfer. Charles argued, his voice pitching high with panic, but eventually stormed out, leaving Beatrice to scurry after him. When Xavier arrived at his own townhouse that evening, the manipulation continued. Madeline was waiting for him in the primary suite. She sat in the center of their pristine white bed, hugging her knees to her chest, her face pale and streaked with tears. She had clearly scoured his briefcase earlier that week and found the redacted medical board file Kendra had provided at the coffee shop. Madeline launched into a masterful display of victimhood. She sobbed quietly, claiming Kendra was a deeply disturbed, vindictive woman who had forged the entire disciplinary report. Madeline spun a tragic tale of how Kendra's drug addiction had nearly destroyed the family 5 years ago. She claimed Charles had paid off the university to save Kendra from prison, and now in her paranoid delusions, Kendra was projecting her own crimes onto her innocent sister. Madeline reached out her hands, trembling perfectly as she grabbed Xavier's shirt, begging him to believe her, begging him to protect their family from Kendra's toxic lies. Xavier looked down at his wife. The revelation struck him with the force of a physical blow. For years he had operated under the assumption that his wife was simply fragile, sensitive to the overwhelming pressures of her elite upbringing. Now viewing her through the lens of cold, hard evidence, the absolute truth clicked into place. The Ross family did not communicate with logic or facts. They traded entirely in emotional manipulation. Tears, panic attacks, and dramatic tantrums were their currency. He recalled the exact moment he had agreed to purchase this wildly overpriced townhouse. Madeline had completely broken down in the broker's office, weeping about her childhood anxiety, and how this specific house was the only place she felt truly safe. He had bypassed his own rigorous financial instincts to dry her tears. Charles had used the exact same tactic to secure his initial investment in Ross Diagnostics, leveraging family loyalty and emotional guilt over a series of high-pressure dinners. It was a systematic, inherited strategy of emotional extortion. Xavier gently detached Madeline's hands from his shirt. He told her he had work to finish and walked out of the bedroom, his expression unreadable. He descended the stairs and locked himself inside his soundproof home office. He poured a single glass of bourbon, sat at his multi-monitor workstation, and bypassed the sanitized financial summaries Charles had provided. Using his venture capital firm's elite clearance, Xavier initiated a deep-dive brute force audit into the proprietary data rooms of Ross Diagnostics. If Charles was desperate enough to bribe a psychiatrist and lie to a judge, the company was not just struggling, it was hiding something catastrophic. Xavier spent 3 hours tearing through the corporate ledgers, searching for the massive financial black hole Marcus Vance had already discovered. He traced the fraudulent Medicare billing and the empty vendor accounts. But Xavier's mind worked differently than a standard accountant. He was a hostile acquisition specialist. He looked past the stolen money and focused intensely on the core asset of the merger. Why was a massive conglomerate like Apex Health willing to absorb a failing company like Ross Diagnostics in the first place? He pulled up the acquisition strategy. Apex Health was not buying the company for its clinics or its management team. They were buying it exclusively for the intellectual property rights to a newly patented diagnostic contrast dye called NovaScan. Charles had aggressively marketed Novascan as a revolutionary non-invasive imaging agent that would completely dominate the global medical market. It was the golden goose that made the entire merger viable. Xavier accessed the encrypted clinical trial data for Novascan. He cross-referenced the raw patient outcomes against the polished, sanitized reports Charles had submitted to the Apex Health Board of Directors. The numbers did not match. Xavier leaned closer to the screen, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Charles had not just altered the revenue projections, he had actively falsified the medical data. Xavier isolated the redacted adverse reaction logs from the original Phase 2 trials. A terrifying pattern emerged from the spreadsheets. A significant percentage of test subjects had experienced severe, rapid-onset anaphylaxis. The chemical compound in Novascan triggered acute respiratory failure in patients with specific common genetic markers. It was a highly dangerous, fundamentally flawed product. Xavier froze. His mind flashed back to the charity gala 3 months ago. He vividly remembered the horrifying chaos in the ballroom. He remembered Kendra collapsing violently against a cocktail table, gasping for air, her throat swelling shut in a matter of seconds. Charles had confidently declared it a severe, spontaneous allergic reaction to the catered seafood, whisking her away to a private medical suite before the paramedics could arrive. Xavier pulled up the guest list and the catering invoice from that specific gala. He cross-referenced the timeline. There was no seafood served at that event. He stared at the glaring anomaly glowing on his monitor. The symptoms of the trial patients mirrored Kendra's collapse flawlessly. Charles had not just stolen his daughter's inheritance or framed her for his other daughter's crimes. He had used the family gala to secretly test a lethal, unstable chemical on his own child. The sharp, persistent buzz of the penthouse intercom shattered the morning silence. I pressed the communication button on the wall panel. The concierge's voice filtered through the speaker, informing me that a bonded courier had just arrived with a strictly confidential package requiring my direct signature. I instructed him to send the courier up. A minute later, the private elevator doors parted, and a man in a crisp uniform handed me a sleek, heavy mahogany box, sealed with a silver clasp. I set the box on my kitchen island and unlatched it. Inside lay a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed golden crest of Ross Diagnostics. I pulled out the heavy cardstock. It was an exclusive VIP invitation to the official merger signing ceremony between Ross Diagnostics and Apex Health, scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning at the Ross corporate headquarters. Tucked behind the formal invitation was a handwritten note on my mother's personal stationery. Kendra, Beatrice's elegant looping cursive read, "Despite your vicious attacks in court yesterday, your father and I have decided to extend grace. We want you in the front row tomorrow. We want you to witness the culmination of the Ross family legacy. Come and watch your father make history. You will finally understand what true untouchable power looks like. Do not miss this." I stared at the note, a cold, humorless smile touching my lips. The sheer staggering arrogance of my parents was almost admirable. Less than 24 hours ago, Charles had attempted to bribe a corrupt psychiatrist to lock me in a psychiatric ward and seize my assets. He had failed spectacularly, publicly humiliating himself before a furious judge. Yet facing a massive financial black hole and impending federal scrutiny, his ego demanded a victory lap. He needed to reassert dominance. He needed me sitting in a folding chair, powerless and defeated, watching him sign the contract that would supposedly save his bankrupt empire and turn him into a billionaire. They truly believed Apex Health was their savior. They believed the massive corporate conglomerate was stepping in blindly to hand them $20 million in liquid capital and absorb their toxic liabilities. They had absolutely no idea who held the leash. I walked into my home office and booted up my encrypted terminal. I bypassed my standard email client and logged directly into the secure executive portal for Apex Health. I initiated a priority video conference. Within 30 seconds, the screen split into 4 high-definition feeds. David Sterling, the public-facing chief executive officer of Apex Health, appeared in the center frame adjusting his tie. The chief financial officer and the head of corporate litigation occupied the other frames. "Good morning, Ms. Ross," David said, offering a respectful nod. "We received the urgent communications from Charles Ross last night. He is in a state of absolute panic. He is demanding we bypass our final 30-day compliance hold and execute the merger documents tomorrow morning. He claims he needs the venture capital injection immediately to stabilize his regional clinics." Charles was not trying to stabilize clinics. He was trying to pay off his offshore debts and plug the massive embezzlement hole before the Securities and Exchange Commission kicked his doors down. "What are your orders regarding the press?" the head of litigation asked. "Charles has invited 3 major financial news networks to broadcast the signing live. He wants to make a spectacle of it to boost his stock price before the bell rings." "Give him exactly what he wants," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of hesitation. "Approve the expedited signing. Prepare the main boardroom. Have the legal team draft the final acquisition contracts, but leave the compliance addendums unsealed. When Charles signs his name, he will trigger the final binding clause of our acquisition strategy." "And the media?" David pressed. "Let them bring their cameras," I instructed. "I want this on the record, every single second of it." I terminated the connection. The screen faded to black. For 8 months, I had operated my private LLC from the shadows, systematically acquiring the majority shareholder rights of Apex Health. I was the silent, absolute authority behind the conglomerate. Charles thought he was selling his company to a faceless corporate giant. He was actually selling it to me. Tomorrow, I would not just own Ross Diagnostics, I would own him. Before I could close the laptop, the intercom buzzed a second time. I walked back to the panel. The concierge sounded slightly agitated. He informed me that a Dr. Logan Campbell was currently standing in the lobby, demanding to speak with me regarding a life-or-death situation involving the Ross Diagnostics clinical trials. Logan Campbell was the chief of clinical research at my father's company. He was a brilliant, highly principled physician who had frequently clashed with Madeline over her reckless patient care protocols. He was also the attending physician who had stabilized me when I suffered my severe anaphylactic shock at the charity gala 3 months ago. I authorized his entry. When the elevator doors opened, Logan stepped out gripping a heavy leather satchel. He looked terrified. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie was askew, and he was sweating despite the chilled air conditioning of the building. He walked directly into my living room and dropped the heavy satchel onto the glass coffee table with a loud thud. "I heard what happened in surrogate court," Logan said, his voice completely breathless. "I know Charles tried to have you committed to silence you. And I know your brother-in-law Xavier breached our secure servers last night. Xavier found the redacted adverse reaction logs for Novascan. He knows the drug causes fatal anaphylaxis. He knows your father tested it on you at the gala." "Xavier is thorough," I replied calmly. "But the trial data alone is not enough to put my family in federal prison. Charles will just blame a clerical error or a rogue lab technician." "That is why I am here," Logan said, unbuckling the leather straps of his satchel. "Xavier found the altered data, but he missed the secondary layer of the fraud. Charles did not orchestrate this cover-up by himself." Logan reached into the bag and pulled out 3 incredibly thick, heavily tabbed binders. He slammed them down next to the satchel. They were official pharmacy dispensing logs carrying the digital watermarks of the Federal Narcotics Tracking System. "Madeline," Logan stated, his voice shaking with absolute disgust. "Your sister is the one who kept the Novascan trials running. When the test subjects began experiencing severe respiratory failure, she did not halt the study. She used her medical license to illegally prescribe massive off-label doses of corticosteroids and counteragents to mask the allergic reactions." I stared at the binders. Madeline had crossed the line from petty theft into catastrophic medical malpractice. "She created hundreds of ghost patients in the system." Logan continued, his words spilling out in a frantic rush. "She funneled the illegal prescriptions through the company pharmacy, suppressing the severe reactions just long enough to falsify the patient success metrics. She artificially inflated the company's valuation to guarantee the Apex Health buyout. She poisoned people, Kendra, and Charles paid her a massive off-the-book salary to keep writing the fraudulent scripts. Logan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small encrypted flash drive. He held it out to me. This drive contains every forged signature, every illegal prescription, and the direct offshore wire transfers connecting Charles's accounts to Madeline's private bank, Logan said. It is the final piece of the puzzle. It proves a coordinated multi-million-dollar federal fraud syndicate. I took the flash drive from his trembling hand. It was cold against my palm. The trap was now flawless. Tomorrow morning, Charles, Beatrice, and Madeline would walk into a boardroom filled with flashing cameras and eager journalists. They would expect a coronation. They would expect to walk out as untouchable billionaires free from their debts and immune to consequence. They were walking directly into a corporate execution. I plugged Logan's encrypted drive into my terminal. Rows of pharmaceutical data flooded the screen instantly. Hundreds of illegal prescriptions. Millions of dollars wired directly from Charles to offshore accounts. Madeline had weaponized her medical license to inflate the value of a dying company. I copied the entire database directly to the secure servers of the Apex Health Legal Department. The trap was now fully operational. I poured myself a glass of water, watching the city lights begin to flicker on across the Manhattan skyline. The sharp chime of the private elevator arrival bell broke the silence of my living room. I turned around just as the stainless steel doors slid open. Madeline stepped out onto the wide plank oak floors. She had clearly bullied the lobby concierge into granting her access, likely throwing a massive tantrum and using the Ross family name like a battering ram to bypass security. She wore a pristine white designer coat and a smug, patronizing expression that I had memorized over 3 decades of forced family holidays. Madeline looked around my penthouse, her eyes slowly scanning the expensive artwork, the custom furniture, and the sweeping panoramic views of the city. I could see the burning jealousy tightening the corners of her mouth, but she quickly buried it beneath a mask of absolute disdain. She folded her arms and sighed heavily, playing the role of the exhausted, magnanimous older sister dealing with a petulant child. "You really have gone completely off the deep end, Kendra." Madeline began, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Hiring actors, renting this absurdly expensive apartment just to put on a show for the court. Dad told me all about your little performance yesterday. He said you actually bribed a court clerk to print a fake property deed." I leaned against the kitchen island, taking a slow sip of water. I did not offer her a seat. I simply watched her spin her web of delusions. "I am here as a courtesy," Madeline continued, stepping further into the room as if she owned it. "Mom and Dad are absolutely disgusted with you. Dad is furious that you tried to sabotage the conservatorship hearing with that illegal wiretap, but they are willing to extend an olive branch. They know you are struggling. They know you are projecting your own failures onto us." She walked over to my glass coffee table, picked up a heavy art book, and dropped it back down with a loud thud, a cheap intimidation tactic she had used since we were teenagers. "Tomorrow morning, Charles Ross becomes a billionaire," Madeline stated, lifting her chin arrogantly. "The Apex Health merger is going to make our family royalty in this city. Xavier and I are going to be managing the international division. We are leaving you behind, Kendra. But I talked to Dad. I told him you are family, and we cannot just abandon you on the street." She offered me a sickeningly sweet, entirely hollow smile. "Just come to the ceremony tomorrow," Madeline demanded, stepping closer. "Just apologize to Mom and Dad, and maybe they will give you a junior position at the new company. Something quiet, something where you cannot cause any more damage. It is a very generous offer, Kendra. You should take it before Dad changes his mind and cuts you out completely." I looked at my older sister. I looked at the woman who had watched me suffocate on the floor of a ballroom and done absolutely nothing. I looked at the doctor who had poisoned innocent people to protect her trust fund. She was standing in my home offering me a meaningless job at a company I already secretly owned. I let out a genuine sharp laugh. It echoed through the high ceilings of the penthouse. Madeline blinked, entirely thrown off guard by my complete lack of intimidation. Her fake smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. She hated being laughed at. It shattered the illusion of control she constantly, desperately craved. "You think this is funny?" Madeline snapped, her voice rising an octave. You are broke, Kendra. You are unemployed and you are completely delusional. We are offering you a lifeline. I set my water glass down on the marble counter. The sharp clink of the glass silenced her. You are offering me a job at a company built on forged FDA approvals. I asked, my voice deadly calm. You always were terrible at math, Madeline. The color completely drained from Madeline's face. She took a sudden involuntary step backward. Her perfectly manicured hands twitched at her sides. For a fraction of a second, the absolute terror of discovery flashed in her eyes. But decades of narcissistic conditioning immediately kicked in. She could not accept defeat. She simply doubled down on the denial. I have no idea what you are talking about, Madeline stammered, her voice shaking slightly, before she forced it back into an arrogant sneer. You are literally insane. You have been spinning these wild conspiracy theories for months. It is embarrassing. You are just jealous because Dad chose me to help run the empire while you get nothing. She turned sharply on her heel and marched back toward the elevator, her designer coat swishing behind her. She aggressively jabbed the call button. Don't bother showing up tomorrow. Madeline spat over her shoulder as the stainless steel door slid open. The offer is officially revoked. Enjoy living in your fake reality, Kendra. We will be busy running the medical world. She stepped into the elevator. The door slid shut, sealing her inside her own manufactured delusion. I stood in the silence of my penthouse for a long moment. I did not feel any anger. I did not feel any residual childhood hurt. I felt the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my phone. I dialed a direct encrypted line that bypassed the standard switchboards. It rang exactly once before a gruff voice answered. Director of Security, I said, staring out at the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city I was about to conquer. Ensure the FBI task force has access to the service elevators tomorrow at 10 a.m. Xavier sat in the suffocating silence of his soundproof home office. The harsh blue light from his multi-monitor workstation illuminated his face, casting long, grim shadows across the mahogany walls. He had spent the last 6 hours tracing the digital footprints of his wife's medical atrocities. The sheer volume of forged prescriptions for potent immunosuppressants was staggering. He had cross-referenced the dates of the clinical trials with the sudden spikes in emergency steroid requisitions signed by Dr. Madeline Ross. The data painted a horrifying, undeniable picture of a woman who had systematically masked fatal allergic reactions to secure a corporate payout. The heavy oak door to the office suddenly swung open. Madeline stood in the threshold, her pristine white designer coat draped over one arm. She marched directly to the wet bar in the corner of the room and poured herself a heavy measure of vodka, her movements sharp and agitated. Your sister-in-law has completely lost her grip on reality, Xavier, Madeline spat, taking a long drink. She leaned against the polished wood of the bar, attempting to project an air of exhausted superiority. I just went to her apartment to offer her a junior position at the new company, a gesture of pure goodwill to keep the peace before the signing tomorrow. Do you know what she did? She laughed in my face and babbled something incomprehensible about forged FDA approvals. She is completely delusional. Xavier did not blink. He slowly turned his leather chair to face her, folding his hands in his lap. He looked at the woman he had shared a bed with for years, searching her face for any trace of humanity, any flicker of guilt regarding the lives she had carelessly endangered. He found absolutely nothing. Her eyes were bright with indignation, entirely focused on her own bruised ego. Madeline, Xavier said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register. I spent the evening reviewing the final data room submissions for the Apex Health merger. I was looking over the clinical trial outcomes for NovaScan. Madeline waved her hand dismissively, swirling the ice in her glass. The outcomes are flawless. Apex Health is getting the absolute gold standard in diagnostic imaging. We are handing them a monopoly on a silver platter. I also reviewed the internal pharmacy logs, Xavier continued, ignoring her grandstanding. I noticed a massive, inexplicable spike in the requisition of epinephrine and high-dose corticosteroids, perfectly correlating with the dates of the Phase 2 NovaScan trials. The requisition orders were all authorized by your personal medical license. Why would you need that volume of emergency counteragents for a routine, non-invasive imaging dye? Madeline froze. The glass in her hand stopped moving. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, revealing the cold, calculating panic beneath. But she recovered with terrifying speed. She set her drink down and walked toward his desk, adopting a tone of patronizing concern. "Xavier, darling, you are a brilliant venture capitalist, but you are not a doctor," Madeline said, offering him a condescending smile. "Those medications are standard protocol to have on standby for any clinical trial involving chemical contrast. It is purely preventative. You are looking at routine compliance logs and letting your pre-merger jitters invent a crisis." Kendra suffered severe rapid-onset anaphylaxis at the charity gala 3 months ago, Xavier stated flatly, refusing to let her change the narrative. "Your father claimed it was a seafood allergy, but there was no seafood served at that event. Your father tested the Novascan compound on his own daughter, and you knew about it." Madeline let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She leaned over his desk, her face inches from his, her eyes hard and devoid of any warmth. "You have been spending far too much time listening to Kendra's paranoid ravings," Madeline sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Are you seriously digging through inventory logs and inventing wild conspiracy theories the night before we become billionaires? It is embarrassing, Xavier. You are acting just as unstable as she is. I am a highly respected physician. My father is a visionary. Leave the medical science to the actual doctors and focus on managing the wealth we are about to hand you." She patted his cheek, a sharp, belittling gesture meant to put him in his place. "I am going to bed," Madeline announced, turning her back on him and walking toward the door. "Wash your face, take a sleeping pill, and pull yourself together. The cameras will be at the corporate headquarters at 10 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning. Do not ruin this for me." The door clicked shut, leaving Xavier alone in the silence. He sat perfectly still, a profound, icy detachment settling over his entire body. He had built his entire career on the foundation of rigorous, unyielding ethical compliance. He was a man who had walked away from 9-figure acquisitions because a single environmental impact report looked suspicious. He had spent his life mitigating risk and avoiding fraudulent investments. Now he realized with absolute horrifying clarity that he was married to a textbook sociopath. Madeline did not care about the patients who had suffered. She did not care that her father had poisoned her own sister. She viewed human life as entirely expendable collateral damage in her pursuit of wealth and status. She was not a victim of Charles Ross's manipulation. She was a willing, active, and lethal participant in his syndicate. Xavier stood up. He did not go upstairs to the primary suite. He walked to the hidden safe behind his bookshelf and unlocked it. He pulled out a sleek, black leather briefcase. Moving with methodical precision, he packed his encrypted hard drives, his passport, and the printed ledgers containing the irrefutable evidence of his wife's medical malpractice. He closed the briefcase and locked the brass clasps. Xavier looked down at his left hand. The heavy gold wedding band caught the harsh light of the monitors. It no longer represented a partnership. It felt like a shackle tying him to a sinking ship of criminality and greed. He slid the ring off his finger. He did not place it gently on the desk. He dropped it directly into the metal wastebasket. He picked up his briefcase, walked out of his office, and bypassed the grand staircase entirely. He stepped out of the front door of the townhouse, pulling the collar of his coat up against the biting chill of the New York night. He did not look back at the illuminated windows of the home he had purchased to dry his wife's fake tears. Standing on the sidewalk, Xavier pulled his phone from his pocket. He bypassed his regular contacts and opened a heavily encrypted messaging application. He selected the secure, untraceable number Kendra had provided him weeks ago at the coffee shop. He typed a single decisive message. "I am out. Burn them." The screen of my encrypted phone lit up in the darkened penthouse. The message from Xavier was brief, clinical, and absolute. "I am out. Burn them." I stared at the glowing text for a fraction of a second, the harsh blue light reflecting in my eyes. I typed a single-word reply, "Done." I deleted the message thread, wiped the device cache, and set the phone face down on the marble counter. The trap was locked. The final piece was in motion. The sun rose over Manhattan, casting a sharp, unforgiving glare across the glass facades of the financial district. I dressed with meticulous, calculated care. There would be no flashy designer logos today, no ostentatious jewelry. I chose a sharply tailored charcoal power suit, a crisp white silk blouse buttoned to the collarbone and simple black heels. It was an outfit devoid of emotion. It was not a wardrobe chosen for a celebration. It was armor forged for an execution. The drive to the Apex Health corporate tower was remarkably quiet. I bypassed the crowded main lobby utilizing the private subterranean garage and took the secured executive elevator directly to the 51st floor. David Sterling, my public-facing chief executive officer, was waiting for me in the hushed antechamber outside the main boardroom. He held a secure tablet displaying the live feed from the security cameras positioned inside the room. "Good morning, Ms. Ross," David murmured, handing me the tablet. "The final contracts are bound and sitting at the head of the table. The compliance addendum is seamlessly tucked into the final pages exactly as you ordered. The media pool is fully set up. The federal agents are currently waiting in the empty offices on the 49th floor ready to move on your signal." I looked down at the monitor. The main boardroom was an absolute circus of corporate vanity. Charles had brought a small army of financial journalists, photographers, and sycophantic legal aides. Despite it not even being 10 o'clock in the morning, champagne corks popped loudly, echoing over the low, greedy hum of high-stakes networking. Charles stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, his face flushed with unearned triumph. He held a crystal flute, shaking hands with the Apex executives who were currently playing their assigned roles to absolute perfection. Beatrice clung to his arm, draped in heavy, ostentatious pearls, and a pale blue Chanel suit playing the wealthy, supportive matriarch with sickening ease. And Madeline. She stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, basking in the rapid flashes of the press cameras. She wore a tailored crimson dress holding her champagne high. She looked completely unbothered, utterly convinced of her own brilliance and invincibility. She clearly had not yet realized that her husband had not come home last night. Her arrogance was a terminal disease. "Let him speak first," I instructed, handing the tablet back to David. "Let him put his entire ego on the public record." I waited exactly 4 minutes. Then I pushed open the heavy oak doors just enough to slip into the back of the crowded room, blending seamlessly into the throng of reporters and junior analysts. The sheer volume of arrogance radiating through the air was suffocating. Charles raised his glass, tapping it sharply with a silver pen to command the room. The chatter immediately died down. The camera lenses pivoted in unison toward the patriarch of the Ross family. Distinguished guests, representatives of the press, and the esteemed executive board of Apex Health. Charles bellowed, his voice rich with practiced hollow charisma. Today marks a historic turning point in the field of medical diagnostics. When I took over Ross Diagnostics, I made a solemn promise to push the boundaries of innovation. I promised to deliver technology that would change the world. He paused, tilting his head slightly, allowing the photographers to capture his benevolent smile. "We stand here today to officially merge our groundbreaking NovaScan technology with the unparalleled resources of Apex Health," Charles continued, projecting his voice to the very back of the room. "But a true visionary cannot build an empire entirely alone. Today I want to publicly recognize the true architect of our clinical success, my brilliant daughter, Dr. Madeline Ross." Charles gestured expansively toward the windows. Madeline stepped forward, offering the cameras a practiced, incredibly humble smile. Madeline spearheaded the clinical trials. Charles boasted, effectively sealing his own fate with every recorded syllable. Her tireless dedication to clinical excellence, her rigorous oversight of patient safety, and her unparalleled medical expertise made this miracle possible. This merger is as much her victory as it is mine. Beatrice clapped politely, beaming with maternal pride. The journalists scribbled furiously on their notepads, capturing every damning word. It was the perfect confession, recorded in high-definition audio, witnessed by 30 independent industry professionals. I stepped out from the shadow of the press pool and walked directly down the center aisle of the boardroom. The crowd naturally parted, sensing the sudden sharp shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. The rhythmic click of my heels against the polished marble floor echoed clearly above the silence. Madeline spotted me first. Her complacent smile vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, ugly scowl. She leaned over and whispered something frantic into Charles's ear. Charles turned, his eyes locked onto mine. The benevolent visionary immediately dissolved, revealing the vicious cornered tyrant lurking beneath the surface. He looked at my charcoal suit, my empty hands, and my completely neutral expression. He misread the situation entirely. He thought I had come to beg. He assumed I had arrived to disrupt his crowning moment of glory with another desperate plea for inclusion or a share of the profits. His massive ego demanded a public display of dominance. He needed the Apex Health executives to witness his absolute control over his family hierarchy. Kendra, Charles said, dropping the charismatic warmth and replacing it with a cold, booming authority. I explicitly instructed the lobby concierge that you were not on the approved guest list. This is a closed corporate proceeding, not a venue for your ongoing emotional breakdowns. The journalists turned in unison, their cameras immediately snapping photos of the brewing family tension. Beatrice scoffed loudly, shaking her head, as if a stray dog had just wandered into a Michelin-starred restaurant. We offered you a chance to be part of this family, Madeline added, her voice ringing out clearly for the reporters to document. But you chose to be destructive. You chose to be bitter. You need to leave, Kendra. You are embarrassing yourself. I did not stop walking. I did not break eye contact with Charles. I stopped exactly 3 feet from the head of the massive mahogany table directly opposite my father. I did not say a single word. I simply let the silence stretch heavy, cold, and utterly suffocating. Charles's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. My absolute refusal to flinch enraged him. He looked past me toward the heavy double doors at the entrance. The Apex Health head of security, a massive, broad-shouldered man named Vance, was standing quietly by the exit, his hands resting on his tactical belt. "Security!" Charles barked, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly at my chest. His voice cracked like a whip across the silent boardroom. "Throw this bitter dropout out of the building. Escort her out of the lobby entirely. She has absolutely no business standing at an executive table." The room held its collective breath. The journalists braced for a physical altercation. Madeline crossed her arms, a triumphant sneer curling her lips. Vance, the head of security, stepped forward. His heavy boots thudded loudly against the marble, but he did not walk toward me. He did not reach for my arm. He did not even look at Charles. Instead, Vance turned his back to the boardroom table, grasped the heavy brass handles of the double doors, and pulled them wide open. Vance gripped the heavy brass handles and pulled the double doors flush against the walls. He did not look at Charles. He stood at rigid attention, his gaze fixed straight ahead, treating the patriarch of the Ross family like empty air. Charles's face contorted in a mix of utter confusion and boiling rage. He opened his mouth to shout another order to threaten Vance with immediate termination, but the words died in his throat. Footsteps echoed from the marble hallway outside. Measured, synchronized, and authoritative. David Sterling, the public-facing chief executive officer of Apex Health, walked through the threshold. He was flanked by the Apex Executive Board, a phalanx of high-powered corporate litigators, and 2 individuals in understated dark suits who carried the distinct, unmistakable posture of federal agents. Charles instantly recognized David. He forcibly swallowed his anger, stretching his mouth into a brilliant camera-ready smile. He smoothed the lapels of his custom suit and stepped forward, extending his hand as if he were welcoming a visiting dignitary. "David, my friend," Charles boomed, projecting his voice for the benefit of the press pool. "Impeccable timing. We were just dealing with a minor trespassing issue. A disgruntled former employee managed to slip past the lobby. We will have her removed immediately so we can proceed with the signing." David Sterling did not take Charles's hand. He did not even break his stride. He walked straight past the extended arm, leaving Charles standing awkwardly in the center of the room. The Apex executives followed suit, bypassing the Ross family entirely. The room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. The popping of champagne corks ceased. The journalists lowered their notepads, sensing a catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. Only the rapid mechanical clicking of camera shutters broke the quiet. David stopped directly in front of me. He snapped his briefcase shut, straightened his posture, and dipped his head in a deep, unmistakable bow of absolute deference. "Good morning, Madam Chair. David said, his voice ringing out clearly in the dead silent room. "The final contracts have been prepared exactly to your specifications. The compliance addendums are in place, and the asset transfer protocols are fully operational." He turned on his heel, facing the bewildered room. He looked directly at Charles, who was currently staring at his own empty, outstretched hand, as if it had betrayed him. "Distinguished guests and members of the press," David announced, his tone purely professional, "allow me to formally introduce the true architect of today's acquisition. Please welcome Kendra Ross, the majority shareholder and senior executive director of Apex Health." A collective gasp rippled through the press pool. The flashbulbs erupted into a blinding strobe light, capturing every micro-expression of horror dawning on my family's faces. Beatrice dropped her clutch. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, spilling expensive cosmetics across the marble. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning white, her carefully constructed high society facade shattering into a million irreparable pieces. "This is a joke," Madeline stated, her voice shrill and trembling. She stepped forward, pointing an accusing finger at David. "This is a ridiculous, tasteless prank. Apex Health is a multinational conglomerate. Kendra is an unemployed dropout who lives in a rented apartment. She does not own Apex. That is mathematically impossible." "It is actually quite simple, Madeline," I replied, my voice calm, slicing through her rising hysteria. "Apex Health spent the last 8 months quietly acquiring distressed regional clinics. You thought it was an aggressive expansion strategy. It was actually a smokescreen. My private LLC, operating through a series of blind trusts, financed those acquisitions in exchange for voting shares. While Charles was busy draining Ross Diagnostics to pay for your illegal offshore wire transfers, I was busy buying the company he was desperately trying to sell himself to." Charles stumbled backward, bumping into a leather boardroom chair. "You—" He gasped, the oxygen completely leaving his lungs. "You are Apex." "I am Apex," I confirmed, stepping up to the side of the massive table. "You did not negotiate a merger with a faceless corporate giant, Charles. You begged me to bail you out. You handed over complete operational control, majority voting rights, and full access to your internal servers because you were too arrogant to look past the dollar signs on the term sheet." "I am the chief medical officer of the merged entity," Madeline shrieked, slamming her hand onto the table. "I have an ironclad employment contract. You cannot touch me." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the encrypted flash drive Logan Campbell had given me. I tossed it onto the polished mahogany. It slid across the smooth surface, stopping inches from Madeline's trembling hands. "You are not a chief medical officer, Madeline," I stated, locking eyes with her. "You are an uninsured liability. That drive contains the unaltered logs from the NovaScan trials. It contains the federal pharmacy dispensing records for the massive quantities of corticosteroids you illegally prescribed to mask the fatal allergic reactions of your test subjects. It contains the wire transfers Charles used to buy your silence. You artificially inflated the valuation of this company by poisoning people." The journalists were practically foaming at the mouth, recording every single devastating detail. Madeline stared at the flash drive as if it were a live grenade. All the color drained from her face. She looked frantically toward the exit, but the 2 federal agents had already moved to block the double doors. "You set us up," Charles whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming authority. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the Apex executives, the reporters, the security guards. He found no allies. He found only witnesses to his execution. "You built this trap," he said, his hands shaking violently. "You built the trap, Charles," I corrected him, my tone devoid of any sympathy. "You committed the fraud. You authorized the cover-up. You endangered lives for a profit margin. I simply opened the door and let you walk yourself directly into a federal indictment." Charles stared at me. The realization of his total inescapable ruin finally penetrated his massive ego. He had sold his company, his legacy, and his freedom to the daughter he had spent 30 years trying to destroy. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into sharp, glittering shards that scattered across the room. The sharp crash echoed like a gunshot in the silent boardroom. I walked past him. I did not look down at the broken glass. I moved to the very head of the mahogany table, pulling out the heavy leather chair that Charles had intended to claim for himself. I sat down, smoothing the lapels of my charcoal suit. I looked down the length of the table at the terrified, broken remnants of the Ross family. "You wanted me to see you become untouchable, Charles?" I asked, leaning forward and resting my hands on the polished wood. "Let's get to work." The shattered crystal of Charles's champagne flute lay scattered across the marble floor, gleaming like fractured diamonds under the harsh boardroom lights. Nobody moved to clean it up. The 30 independent industry professionals, journalists, and Apex executives stood frozen in a state of collective shock. I adjusted the cuffs of my charcoal blazer and rested my hands flat against the mahogany table. I felt no surge of vindictive joy. There was no chaotic gloating. I operated with the terrifying clinical precision of a corporate executioner. I nodded to David Sterling. He immediately tapped a sequence into his secure tablet. The heavy motorized blinds slid shut over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the sunlit room into a dramatic twilight. The massive presentation screen at the far end of the boardroom descended from the ceiling with a quiet, mechanical hum. I pressed a button on the small remote resting near my hand. The screen illuminated the faces of my family with a stark, blinding white light. Complex spreadsheets highlighted digital signatures and federal pharmacy dispensing logs flooded the massive display. The logo at the top right corner clearly read Ross Diagnostics, but these were not the sanitized, heavily curated files Charles had submitted for the merger. "What you are looking at," I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy silence, "is the unredacted, completely raw clinical trial data for the Novascan compound. This is the exact database your chief medical officer, Dr. Madeline Ross, attempted to scrub from the internal servers at 3 o'clock this morning." Madeline gripped the back of a leather boardroom chair, her knuckles turning a bloodless white. Her crimson dress suddenly looked less like a symbol of power and more like a target. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Charles slammed his hand onto the table, his face a mottled, unhealthy purple. "This is a complete fabrication. You hacked our servers and planted fake data to ruin this merger. You have always been a bitter, jealous disappointment. You are trying to destroy the only people who ever put a roof over your head." I looked at him, my expression entirely hollow. "For 5 years, you told everyone I was a failure, making pretty pictures on a computer," I stated coldly, advancing the slide to show a complex web of financial transfers. "You mocked my tech startups at every Thanksgiving dinner. You told your country club friends I was wasting my life on meaningless code." I took a slow, deliberate breath, ensuring the press pool caught every single word. "What I was actually doing was tracking the offshore shell companies you used to hide your failed clinical trials. Trials that put thousands of highly vulnerable asthma patients at severe risk." A collective gasp rippled through the journalists. The furious clicking of camera shutters intensified, capturing the damning evidence projected on the wall. "You marketed Novascan as a revolutionary respiratory imaging dye specifically designed for chronic asthmatics." I continued, pointing to the severe adverse reaction reports flashing across the screen. "Patients with deeply compromised airways. When the compound triggered rapid onset anaphylaxis, causing complete respiratory failure." Madeline did not halt the study. She weaponized her medical license. She pumped those patients full of illegal off-label corticosteroids to mask the allergic reactions long enough to falsify the success metrics. "You turned your regional clinics into testing grounds on people who could barely breathe." The journalists erupted into a frenzy of whispered commentary. The two federal agents standing by the exit stepped slightly forward, their presence a silent, terrifying promise of what was about to happen. Charles looked wildly at the Apex Health executives, desperately trying to find a sympathetic face. "David, you cannot possibly believe this manufactured garbage. She is mentally unstable. She has a history of these delusions. I am the CEO of Ross Diagnostics. I demand that you remove her from this building." David Sterling did not even blink. He kept his eyes respectfully trained on me. "You are the CEO of Ross Diagnostics, Charles." David replied, his tone devoid of any emotion. "As of exactly 8 minutes ago, Apex Health exercised its majority shareholder rights. You have been terminated with cause, effective immediately." The absolute reality of the situation finally crashed down on the room. Beatrice could no longer maintain her polished aristocratic facade. The horrifying realization of losing her wealth, her social standing, and her entire identity shattered her carefully constructed composure. She stepped forward, her pale blue Chanel suit trembling as she pointed a shaking finger directly at the projection screen. "It is a lie!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking with absolute hysteria. "She is a liar. She forged all of it. My husband is a brilliant man. My daughter is a respected doctor. We are the Ross family, and you are nothing but a jealous, vindictive little girl trying to tear down her betters. Someone arrest her." The heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open once more. The sound was sharp enough to cut off Beatrice's frantic screaming. A man in a perfectly tailored navy suit walked into the room. He did not look at Madeline. He did not look at Charles. He walked directly toward the side of the table, occupied by the Apex Health legal team. It was Xavier. He looked entirely exhausted, but possessed a rigid, unyielding clarity. He carried a single heavy black briefcase. He stopped directly across from where his wife and my parents stood. He placed the briefcase flat onto the polished mahogany table. The heavy brass clasps clicked loudly in the silent room. Madeline stared at him, her eyes wide with sudden unadulterated panic. She looked down at his left hand. His ring finger was completely bare. "It is not a lie, Beatrice," Xavier stated, his voice echoing with absolute devastating finality. He looked directly at Charles, who was now visibly trembling, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. "I spent the entire night verifying the internal pharmacy ledgers against the trial dates. The medical fraud is real. The shell companies are real. My venture capital firm just pulled all our backing. You are officially bankrupt." The heavy silence following Xavier's declaration felt like all the oxygen had been vacuumed from the boardroom. The financial journalists in the back row immediately scrambled for their phones, their thumbs flying across screens to break the news of the century. Ross Diagnostics was not just dead, it was an active crime scene. David Sterling and the Apex Health legal team took a synchronized step backward, physically distancing themselves from Charles and Beatrice, as if their corruption was a contagious disease. Madeline stood frozen by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her pristine makeup looking like a theatrical mask painted on a corpse. Her chest heaved in sharp, erratic jerks. The absolute reality of her situation was finally breaching the fortress of her arrogance. Her father's company was bankrupt. The merger was a sting operation. The federal agents guarding the doors were not there for corporate security. They were her impending escort to a holding cell. Her eyes darted frantically around the room until they locked onto Xavier. He was her safety net. He was a powerhouse venture capitalist with infinite resources, crisis management teams, and high-powered fixers on speed dial. Madeline lunged forward, her crimson dress rustling sharply in the quiet room. She grabbed Xavier's forearm, her perfectly manicured nails digging desperately into the fine wool of his navy suit. "Xavier, do something! You're my husband!" Madeline demanded, her voice a shrill, hyperventilating screech. "Call your legal team. Freeze the asset transfers. Get these reporters out of here. Tell them this is a targeted smear campaign by a deranged family member." Xavier did not flinch. He did not reach out to comfort her. He looked down at the hand clutching his arm, and then he looked directly into his wife's eyes. His expression held no anger, no sorrow, and no lingering affection. It contained only absolute, unadulterated disgust. He calmly reached over and physically pried her fingers off his jacket, dropping her hand as if he had just touched something toxic. "I spent the last 12 hours analyzing the encrypted hard drives you thought your IT department had permanently wiped," Xavier stated, his voice a low, steady hum that carried effortlessly across the silent boardroom. "I read every internal memo. I traced the dark money routed through the Caymans to pay off the families of the clinical trial victims. I reviewed the original timestamps on the Novascan developmental research." Madeline stumbled backward, shaking her head in frantic, jerky motions. "No, Xavier, you do not understand. My father forced me into those protocols. Charles made me do it to save the company." Do not insult my intelligence by playing the victim, Madeline. Xavier countered, his tone dropping to a glacial chill. I saw the server logs from 5 years ago. I saw what you did before Novascan was even ready for human trials. He turned slightly, ensuring his voice carried to the press pool and to Kendra, who sat silently at the head of the table. I married a woman I thought was a brilliant doctor. I found out I married a fraud who poisoned her sister's lab samples and forged FDA documents, Xavier said, delivering the words with terrifying precision. The journalist furiously recorded the revelation. The truth of Kendra's supposed academic failure was finally laid bare under the glaring boardroom lights. You did not just steal Kendra's foundational research for the imaging dye. Xavier continued, dismantling Madeline's entire career piece by piece. When she was days away from proving the compound's fatal toxicity during the preliminary stages, you deliberately introduced contaminants into her clean room. You destroyed months of her work, altered the data to make her look incompetent, and used your father's influence to have her expelled from the research program. You stole her life's work, slapped your name on the patent, and pushed a lethal product to market just so you could call yourself a visionary. It was my research! Madeline shrieked, her composure shattering completely. Tears of pure selfish panic streamed down her face, ruining her meticulous mascara. I am the doctor. I am the one with the credentials. She was just a lab assistant. You are supposed to protect me. Charles groaned, clutching his chest as he sank heavily into a leather chair. Beatrice buried her face in her hands, weeping loudly, as the illusion of her aristocratic dynasty burned to the ground in front of the most influential people in Manhattan. Xavier ignored them all. He opened the heavy brass clasps of his black briefcase. He did not pull out a crisis management strategy. He did not produce a legal injunction to save his wife. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He handed the envelope directly to Madeline. She took it automatically, her hands trembling so violently the thick paper rattled. Then Xavier reached into his trouser pocket. He pulled out the heavy gold wedding band he had removed the night before. He looked at the ring for a fraction of a second, the symbol of a partnership built on a foundation of lethal lies. Madeline's empty crystal champagne flute sat on the edge of the mahogany table, abandoned after her father's ill-fated toast. Xavier held his hand over the glass. He released the ring. It dropped into the crystal flute with a sharp, resonant clink that echoed throughout the paralyzed boardroom. Divorce papers. My lawyers will be in touch, Xavier stated, his voice completely hollow. He snapped his briefcase shut. He did not look at Charles slumping in his chair. He did not look at Beatrice weeping into her pearls. He did not look at Madeline, who was staring down at the gold ring sitting at the bottom of her glass, hyperventilating as her entire world ended. Xavier turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd of journalists parted for him instantly. The two federal agents guarding the doors stepped aside, offering him a brief nod of professional acknowledgement. He walked out of the boardroom and into the quiet marble hallway, leaving the Ross family to face the absolute ruin they had built for themselves, and he never looked back. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind Xavier, severing the absolute last thread of salvation the Ross family possessed. The silence in his wake lasted exactly 2 seconds before the boardroom erupted into clinical, highly choreographed chaos. David Sterling did not shout or display a single ounce of panic. He simply raised his hand. The Apex Health legal team moved with the synchronized, terrifying precision of a military unit executing an extraction. Heavy leather briefcases snapped shut in rapid succession. The sound echoed through the room like a volley of gunfire. Documents were swept into secure, encrypted folders. Laptops were slammed closed. The high-powered corporate litigators actively backed away from the mahogany table, physically distancing themselves from the Ross family as if their corruption was an airborne contagion. The merger was not just dead, it was radioactive. Charles watched his billion-dollar lifeline evaporate in real time. The reality of his absolute ruin finally breached the fortified walls of his monumental ego. He looked at the departing lawyers, then at the federal agent standing impassively by the exit, and finally his gaze locked directly onto me. The carefully constructed mask of the benevolent visionary patriarch completely dissolved, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The realization that he had been systematically dismantled by the daughter he deemed worthless turned his shock into violent, blinding anger. He let out a visceral, guttural roar and lunged toward the head of the table. He intended to cross the mahogany expanse and physically rip me from the chair. He moved with the desperate, explosive energy of a cornered predator. He did not make it past the first leather seat. Vance moved with terrifying speed for a man of his immense size. The apex head of security stepped cleanly into Charles's path, planting his boots and intercepting the charge. Vance did not merely block my father. He caught Charles by the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, lifted him slightly off his polished shoes, and drove him backward. Charles hit the heavy oak paneling of the boardroom wall with a dull, heavy thud. Vance pinned him there effortlessly, his thick forearm pressed firmly across Charles's collarbone. Charles struggled wildly, his face turning a mottled, unhealthy purple, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. Beatrice shrieked a high, piercing sound that completely shattered her aristocratic composure. She dropped her designer handbag and rushed toward the wall, beating her manicured fists uselessly against Vance's broad back. She demanded that he release her husband. She threatened to sue Apex Health into absolute oblivion. She screamed that they were the esteemed Ross family, and they would not be subjected to this barbaric humiliation. Vance ignored her entirely. His eyes remained locked onto Charles, waiting patiently for my command. Madeline did not rush to defend her father. She backed away from the table, staring at the shattered remains of her career projected on the massive screen. True to her textbook sociopathic nature, her instinct for self-preservation immediately overrode any shred of familial loyalty. She raised her hands, palms facing outward, and looked directly at David Sterling. She loudly proclaimed that she was acting under extreme duress. She stated for the record that Charles had threatened to strip her medical license and completely cut her out of the family trust if she did not comply with the altered Nova Scan protocols. She offered to turn state's evidence and testify against him in exchange for total legal immunity. I remained seated. I folded my hands on the polished wood of the table, projecting absolute corporate detachment. I looked at Madeline, watching her attempt to throw her father to the wolves to save her own skin. "Immunity is not an option available to you, Madeline," I stated, my voice echoing clearly over Beatrice's hysterical sobbing. "Your signature authorized every single requisition of emergency corticosteroids. Your medical license was the sole mechanism used to facilitate the cover-up inside the clinics. You are not a victim of Charles's ambition. You are the principal architect of the medical malpractice. I advise you to stop talking. The journalists in this room are currently recording your unsolicited, uncoerced confession." Madeline snapped her mouth shut, her chest rising and falling in rapid, terrified pants. She backed against the glass of the window, finally realizing there was no escape hatch. Charles continued to struggle against Vance's unyielding hold. He spat out that his legal retainers would tie this corporate sabotage up in civil court for decades. He boasted that his political connections would bury any internal investigation before it ever saw the inside of a courtroom. He insisted he was untouchable. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal blazer. I walked slowly around the edge of the table, stopping just out of his physical reach. I looked at my father with the cold, calculating precision he had always demanded from his subordinates. "You fundamentally misunderstand the nature of your current predicament, Charles," I explained, delivering the facts with lethal clarity. "This is not a civil dispute over intellectual property. This is not an internal corporate inquiry regarding regulatory compliance." I gestured to the projection screen, illuminating the dark money transfers and the forged FDA approval documents. "By knowingly presenting fabricated clinical data to artificially inflate the valuation of a company during a multi-million-dollar acquisition, you have crossed a massive legal threshold." I continued. "Attempting to finalize this merger with falsified documents constitutes massive, systemic federal wire fraud. You utilized interstate banking channels to secure your initial funding based entirely on lethal lies. You defrauded your investors. You defrauded the federal government. You are not dealing with a civil lawsuit." The journalist scribbled furiously. The room fell dead silent again, the crushing weight of the federal charges settling over the Ross family like concrete. Beatrice collapsed into a nearby chair, openly sobbing into her hands. Madeline stood paralyzed, completely out of options. Charles stared at me, the fight finally draining out of his body as the inescapable reality of his situation took root. I checked the gold watch on my left wrist. The timing was absolutely perfect. I looked back at Charles, offering him a slight, chilling smile. "I didn't invite you here to sign a contract," I stated, my voice ringing out in the silent room. "I invited you here because it is a highly secure location for the authorities to make a federal arrest without endangering the general public." A sharp, singular sound pierced the heavy silence of the antechamber. The executive elevator dinged. The metallic chime of the executive elevator sliced through the heavy silence of the antechamber. The polished steel doors slid open smoothly, revealing a synchronized wall of dark windbreakers, bearing the bright, unmistakable yellow lettering of the FBI and the SEC. A dozen federal agents stepped onto the plush carpet, moving with a heavy-footed, uncompromising authority that instantly shrank the massive boardroom. This was no longer a corporate negotiation or a hostile takeover. This was a targeted tactical takedown. A tall, stern-faced lead agent with silver hair and a rigid posture walked directly past the paralyzed Apex Health executives and the frantically typing financial journalists. He did not look at the projected evidence on the screen or the shattered champagne glass on the floor. He marched straight to the head of the mahogany table, pulling a thick stack of folded, stamped documents from the inner pocket of his jacket. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from where Charles was still pinned against the oak paneling by Vance. "Charles Ross, Beatrice Ross, and Dr. Madeline Ross," the lead agent announced, his voice carrying the flat, echoing cadence of law enforcement. "I have federal warrants for your arrest." He held up the paperwork, presenting it to the room. "You are officially being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the deliberate falsification of federal medical trial data." The words dropped like concrete blocks. The journalists in the back row erupted. Camera shutters fired in a blinding strobe light frenzy, capturing the exact second the Ross family empire was officially designated as a criminal enterprise. Charles tried to summon one final desperate surge of authority. He pushed against Vance's hold, his face a mottled, furious red. He demanded to call his attorneys. He shouted that he was personal friends with 2 state senators, and that this entire operation was an illegal, orchestrated misunderstanding manufactured by a disgruntled daughter. But his voice cracked. The booming, intimidating bluster of the billionaire patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by the reedy, panicked pitch of a cornered criminal. The lead agent did not even blink. He simply nodded to Vance. The Apex head of security stepped back, releasing Charles into the waiting grasp of 2 federal agents. They spun Charles around effortlessly, slamming his hands behind his back. Madeline backed away until she hit the floor-to-ceiling glass of the windows, trapped like an animal in a cage. 2 female agents approached her with clinical efficiency. Madeline began hyperventilating again, raising her hands in a futile attempt to ward them off. She babbled incoherently about her medical license, screaming that she had been manipulated, desperately trying to throw her father under the bus one last time to save herself. The agents ignored her hysterics. They grabbed her wrists, pulling her arms down forcefully. The metallic ratcheting sound of handcuffs locking into place echoed sharply over the noise of the flashing cameras. The brilliant, esteemed chief medical officer of Ross Diagnostics was reduced to a weeping, hyperventilating mess, her pristine crimson dress wrinkling as she was roughly restrained. Beatrice was the last to be apprehended. As an agent reached for her arms, she shrieked, recoiling, as if the officer's touch would physically burn her skin. She looked wildly around the room, making direct eye contact with the financial press pool. Her country club reputation, her charity gala status, her entire pristine aristocratic social identity was currently being broadcast as a spectacular criminal downfall. The agent firmly grasped her wrists, pulling them together. The heavy steel cuffs clamped tightly over the sleeves of her expensive powder blue Chanel suit. The physical reality of the steel binding her wrists completely broke her. Beatrice's legs gave out. She slumped to her knees right there on the marble floor. She looked up at me, mascara running down her pale cheeks in dark, jagged rivers, destroying her carefully painted mask. The arrogance, the condescension, and the lifelong entitlement were completely wiped away, replaced by a pathetic, desperate groveling. "We're your family!" Beatrice sobbed, her voice cracking into a ragged, hysterical wail that cut through the noise of the boardroom. "How can you do this to your own blood? We gave you everything." I stood perfectly still. I looked down at the woman who had spent 3 decades making me feel like an unwanted, worthless burden. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. My expression remained entirely impassive, a flawless mirror of the cold indifference she had shown me my entire life. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, looking directly into her tear-streaked eyes. "You stopped being my family the night you watched me suffocate and told me to get up because I was ruining your party." I stated, my voice dropping to a low, glacial chill that silenced her weeping. The memory was as vivid as the flashing cameras around us. I had been 16, collapsed on the marble floor of their grand foyer, my lungs seizing from a severe asthma attack during one of her extravagant summer galas. Beatrice had stepped gracefully over my gasping body to greet a local politician, hissing under her breath that I was being dramatic and embarrassing her. They had not called an ambulance. They had ordered the catering staff to drag me out the back door and told me to wait in the dark garage until I learned how to breathe quietly. I looked from Beatrice kneeling on the floor to Charles struggling uselessly in the grip of the agents, and finally to Madeline, who was sobbing uncontrollably against the glass. "I survived that night without you." I continued, the absolute finality of my words hanging in the air. "And I built an empire without your money, without your name, and without your support. You always told me I needed to learn how to stand on my own 2 feet." I offered them a single hollow smile. "I'm just giving you the independence you always wanted me to have." The lead agent signaled to his team. They hoisted Beatrice to her feet. The Ross family, completely stripped of their power, their stolen wealth, and their dignity, was marched out of the boardroom in handcuffs. The press pool followed them like a pack of wolves, the cameras flashing relentlessly to document every second of their humiliating descent. The morning after the arrests, the collapse of the Ross family empire dominated every major news network across the globe. The footage of Charles, Beatrice, and Madeline being marched out of the Apex Health building in handcuffs played on a continuous, inescapable loop. Financial pundits dissected the staggering scale of the fraud, while medical ethicists publicly condemned the horrific clinical trial abuses. The federal government moved with swift, unyielding force. The SEC immediately froze every single asset tied to the Ross name. The offshore shell companies were seized. The sprawling Connecticut estate was placed under federal lock and key. Charles and Beatrice, stripped of their immense wealth and political influence, found themselves sitting in holding cells, forced to rely on court-appointed public defenders. The high society friends who had eagerly attended their extravagant galas vanished instantly, deleting the Ross family from their contacts as if they had never existed. Madeline faced the most brutal, rapid reckoning of them all. Within 48 hours of her federal indictment, the state medical board convened an emergency hearing. The unredacted clinical trial data, complete with her forged signatures and authorized illegal corticosteroid requisitions, provided indisputable proof of her malpractice. She was stripped of her medical license permanently. The brilliant, untouchable doctor was officially recognized as a dangerous fraud. She was barred from ever practicing medicine again, facing a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. 6 months later, the toxic fallout of the Ross family had completely settled, leaving behind a profound, vibrant quiet in its wake. I walked briskly through the winding, tree-lined paths of Central Park, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs with an effortless, steady rhythm. The physical transformation I had undergone over the past half-year was startling. For my entire life, my asthma had been a debilitating anchor, a constant source of panic that left me gasping for air at the slightest provocation. But as the months passed away from my family, I discovered a profound medical truth. The severity of my condition had been massively amplified by the suffocating, relentless psychological abuse I endured under their roof. Without Charles constantly belittling my worth, without Beatrice treating my existence as an embarrassing stain on her social record, and without Madeline actively sabotaging my every move, my body finally stopped fighting itself. The chronic inflammation subsided, the panic attacks vanished. I walked for miles without ever needing to reach for the emergency inhaler in my pocket. I was breathing freely, entirely untethered from the ghosts of my past. I stepped out of the park and walked 2 blocks to a quiet upscale cafe in Midtown. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered. I spotted Xavier sitting at a small table near the back, 2 steaming cups of dark roast coffee already waiting. He looked up and offered a warm, relaxed smile. He looked 10 years younger. The deep, heavy exhaustion that used to permanently shadow his features during his marriage to Madeline was entirely gone. He wore a sharp, tailored gray suit, radiating the quiet, formidable energy of a man who had successfully reclaimed his life. I took the seat across from him, picking up my coffee cup. We sat in companionable silence for a moment, simply acknowledging the shared reality of our survival. The final divorce decree came through this morning. Xavier stated, his tone completely matter-of-fact. It was entirely uncontested. Madeline's public defender advised her against wasting the court's time. She is officially transferring to a federal facility in upstate New York next week. I read that Charles is attempting to negotiate a plea deal by offering up the names of his silent partners. I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Though I doubt the federal prosecutors are in any mood to negotiate. They aren't, Xavier confirmed, taking a sip from his own cup. My venture capital firm officially finalized the rebranding yesterday. We severed every remaining tie to the Ross portfolio. Our new medical tech investments are soaring. It feels like waking up from a decade-long nightmare. He set his cup down and looked at me with genuine, profound respect. You saved a lot of lives, Kendra, Xavier said quietly. If you had not secured that data, Madeline would have pushed that compound through the final FDA hurdles. You stopped a catastrophe. I just corrected the data, I replied, my voice steady and entirely at peace. The truth simply took out the trash. We finished our coffee discussing the evolving landscape of ethical medical technology and the new startups making actual legitimate breakthroughs. There was no lingering trauma in our conversation. There was no sorrow for the people sitting in federal holding cells. We were simply 2 seasoned professionals who had navigated a catastrophic storm and emerged completely intact. We parted ways on the sidewalk, with a firm, respectful handshake, both heading toward incredibly bright futures. I walked 3 blocks south to a towering skyscraper composed of gleaming glass and steel. I stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it to the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal the pristine, bustling headquarters of my own independent medical analytics firm. My staff offered bright, genuine greetings as I walked down the central corridor. There was no fear in this office, no toxic manipulation, and no frantic scrambling to appease an unstable tyrant. I had built a company culture rooted in absolute transparency and relentless innovation. I opened the heavy glass door to my corner office. Sunlight poured through the panoramic windows, illuminating the spectacular, sprawling view of the Manhattan skyline. I walked over to the glass, looking out over the city that was now entirely my own. I closed my eyes. I took a slow, deep, completely effortless breath of clean air. My lungs expanded, fully strong and unburdened. I opened my eyes, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across my face. I walked over to my sleek, modern desk, sat down in my chair, and opened my laptop to conquer the day. The ultimate, sweetest revenge was not the sight of my family in handcuffs. It was this exact moment. It was a life lived beautifully, successfully, and completely free-breathing, easily far away from those who had once tried to keep me down. The most profound lesson from this story is that your worth is never defined by those who actively try to diminish it. When anchored to a toxic environment that demands your submission and sacrifices your well-being, true liberation does not come from desperately seeking their approval. Instead, it comes from drawing unbreakable boundaries and fiercely building your own independence. Kendra proved that the ultimate vindication isn't merely the downfall of her abusers, but achieving a successful, authentic life where she can finally breathe freely. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to reclaim your strength? Share your experience in the comments below.